Hello and welcome to Frank Philosophy, where we speak frankly about philosophy. I'm your host, Frank, a philosopher. I have a BA, an MPhil, and a PhD in philosophy, and I teach philosophy at a university far, far away. And today we'll be looking at a work by a guy named David Hume, who is one of the major figures from the modern period of philosophy, what's commonly called the modern period, which begins roughly with Descartes and ends roughly with, well, sometimes Hume, but I think canonically it's Kant who really is the end of the modern period of philosophy, which refers to, among other things, this sort of very long back and forth between the two major poles of the modern period, which was rationalism versus empiricism, right? So rationalism, which is most associated with Descartes, Spinoza, and Leibniz, which is a view which says that reason is the ultimate guide to knowledge, specifically the use of reason, deducing things from first principles, and a few of those first principles we possess innately, right? So this idea that we possess innate ideas is a cornerstone of rationalist philosophy, that we are born with ideas within us from which we can derive many, many others using our reason alone. To contrast that is empiricism, which rejects that we have innate ideas and instead believes that the main way that we know things is not through the use of our pure reason, but instead through the perception of things through our senses. This is mostly associated with the tradition of that goes from John Locke and through to David Hume. So David Hume is sort of the Locke and Hume are sort of the quintessential British empiricists. And a little more about Hume, I guess more so than Locke. One of the reasons that I'm talking about Hume in a video is because, well, he just casts such a huge shadow on the rest of the way that philosophy has been done since his time. He's raised a lot of very interesting, and important problems and issues that really set the way that at least contemporary English-speaking analytic philosophy is done. A lot of debates go back to Hume. A lot of debates, even if they don't go back to Hume, they use Humean points of reference when we're framing stuff, especially in like Metaethics, the problem of induction, skepticism, right? So he's got all sorts of big ideas that go way beyond the scope of this video. And he's got a couple. Well, the main work is called The Treatise of Human Nature. I think that's what it's called. A treatise on human nature, maybe. And that thing is like, I don't know, many hundreds of pages. It's a monster. It's a beast. Well worth the read. I don't know if I'll read through it on this channel. Instead, today we'll be looking at this little ditty called Of the Standard of Taste. And I picked this not only because it's short, but also because I think it's a good introduction to the way that Hume approaches things, and it sort of gives good excuses to talk about other features of Hume's thought, and just could sort of introduce you to the way that he thinks about stuff, and it's also interesting in its own right, just for the ideas themselves. So it's not too long; it's only 19 pages. So it probably won't be like 4 hours like the Descartes video, but strap in, I guess, right? Okay. Of the Standard of Taste. I guess I'll say a little bit more background. He does it right here. He just gets right into it. So I guess maybe I won't say any background, other than the fact that I got this from CSU LB. What's that? California State University, Long Beach, I believe. There's a free version of this work on that website. There's a link to that down in the description. This I've just pasted into Word and changed the font so it's a little easier to read on the screen. And I've also added in some footnotes for references to like, obscure things that, modern people might not be as familiar with as Hume was, right? He's basically, he makes references to popular culture and literature of the day that, you or I don't read. Nobody reads that stuff anymore. I mean, maybe some people do. Maybe they should, but we'll find out why Hume thinks they don't, right? Because that's the topic. Taste, right? So let's get into it. The great variety of taste, as well as of opinion, which prevails in the world is too obvious not to have fallen under everyone's observation. So this is great. This is a really good first sentence for a philosophy article, right? And this is an article. This is not an excerpt from a book. It's not part of a bigger work. It's just something that he published on his own about, why is it that everybody disagrees about matters of taste, right? Why do we disagree about, what's, he's really talking about aesthetic judgments, right? Or judgments of beauty, judgments of, what's a good show on Netflix, I guess, what makes a good play, right? He's talking about like artistic and literary works, right? So taste in that stuff, right? That's the main topic. We'll see how this is, his focus on taste is a bit more general than, being applied to just a few different things. We'll see how it relates to his view of how moral judgments work, because judgments of taste, namely aesthetic judgments and moral judgments, are related in some interesting ways in Hume. But for now, let's just, that's what he means by taste. We'll just take that for now. And this is a great first sentence because it's really good to start any philosophy paper with just a really obvious first sentence, right? Something that nobody can disagree with, right? And this is a great example of that, right? The great variety of taste as well as of opinion which prevails in the world is too obvious not to have fallen under everyone's observation. Meaning, it's totally obvious to anyone with eyes and a working brain that people disagree in matters of taste, right? Men of the most confined knowledge are able to remark a difference of taste in the narrow circle of their acquaintance, even where the persons have been educated under the same government and have early imbibed the same prejudices, right? So even people who live in the same place, who grew up in the same towns, who grew up in the same countries, who are at a similar level of education, who have grown up with the same prejudices, right? Even people with all that, they still end up disagreeing about, what's the best thing to watch on Netflix, right? But those who can enlarge their view to contemplate distant nations and remote ages are still more surprised at the great inconsistence and contrariety. We are apt to call barbarous whatever departs widely from our own taste and apprehension, but soon find the epithet of reproach retorted on us. And the highest arrogance and self-conceit is at last startled on observing an equal assurance on all sides and scruples amidst such a contest of sentiment to pronounce positively in its own favor. So again, this is, I think, to further just drive home the point that, even people, who are, learned in matters of the past, right? People who read history and people who travel and see, and see, distant cultures and customs that are very different from their own. They still can't help but, judge and think that, oh, that's really weird how they do things over there. Oh, that was crazy that they did all that stuff back then. Or it's striking to even the most well-read, and knowledgeable persons that things are kind of crazy and different all over the world and all throughout the ages. So that's kind of surprising, right? As this variety of taste is obvious to the most careless inquirer, so it will be found on examination to be still greater in reality than in appearance, right? So this is interesting, this use of reality and appearance. So appearance and reality, right? Classic philosophical distinction, right? How things seem or appear versus how they really are. So this is how he's approaching it, right? He's saying that, things appear as if, our opinions are all over the place. People have different customs in different parts of the world, and even if we recognize the limits of our own customs as they are in our own, as they are relegated to our own geography or period of time, we still can't help but have a bit of judgment towards others, and it's not a good thing, but you can't deny it, right? It's still something that we do. It's just what we do, and that's just on the appearance level. And he's saying that, well, even though it appears that way, in reality it's even worse, right? In reality, the real on the ground situation regarding the differences of opinion and in matters of taste throughout the world and throughout history is really shocking. Right? The sentiments of men often differ with regard to beauty and deformity of all kinds, even while their general discourse is the same. So, and this is, well, I'll let him develop the argument. There are certain terms in every language which import blame and others praise, and all men who use the same tongue must agree in their application of them. Every voice is united in applauding elegance, propriety, simplicity, spirit in writing, and in blaming fustian, affectation, coldness, and a false brilliancy. Right. So, there's a lot going on here. The idea is that when we use these terms, which he's talking about matters of taste, which refers to sentiments, right, our opinions, the things that we approve of and disapprove of, in terms of blame and praise, and he's associating that with beauty and deformity, right? So he's sort of giving a definition. I don't know if definition is the right word, but at least an explanation of how we use words like beauty and deformity in terms of how, being something that's praiseworthy or blameworthy, right? So something being beautiful, like a beautiful work of art, is something that we're going to praise as beautiful. And something that's not so great, we might, we don't really blame it, but we say it's not very good. Right, we express a negative opinion about it, right? And in all different languages, right, where we have words, we have words that work like these, right? Where we, by using the word, we express, a praise or blame attitude, right? And that's, and we know the meaning of the word by agreeing in what things to praise and blame, right? So if we were to go out and praise a murder, you might say, or if we were to deem a murder to be good, right, then we would be praising a murder, right? We would be endorsing a murder. But that's weird because usually we don't do that. Because murder is something that we don't praise. We think that's a blameworthy action. Right. And so he's giving some examples of this in the aesthetic sphere, right? And he says that, look, we all say that in general, there are some things we should praise and some things we should not praise, we should blame, right? In general, right? Things that are beautiful, we should praise. Things that are deformed, he says, we should blame, right? And within that sphere, there's even, more specific terms, right? If we call something elegant, we applaud it, right? We have these, slightly different connotations for, propriety, simplicity, right? That stuff is all praiseworthy in an artistic or literary context, in the context of writing, right? And we're all kind of in agreement about that, and that's impressive to Hume, right? But when critics come to particulars, this seeming unanimity vanishes, and it is found that they have affixed a very different meaning to their expressions. In all matters of opinion and science, the case it opposite. Oh, that might be a typo. The case is opposite. The difference among men is there oftener found to lie in generals than in particulars, and to be less in reality than in appearance. An explanation of the terms commonly ends the controversy, and the disputants are surprised to find that they had been quarreling, while at bottom they agreed in their judgment. Okay, so what's going on here is he's saying that, when we're talking about matters of taste, a lot of us will agree that beauty is praiseworthy and that ugliness is blameworthy, or deformity is blameworthy. And I mean deformity in a sort of value-laden sense of, something that's, blameworthy, right? We could just use that as a definition, right? I'm not saying that any specific thing is blameworthy. I'm just saying that that's like the opposite of what we mean by praiseworthy or beautiful, right? Is this idea of deformity. I'm just using his terminology, right? Deformity of all kinds, right? In general, we all agree that, beautiful things should be praised. That's what it means to be beautiful, that it should be praised, right? And we even have slightly more specific terms that are also elicit praise or blame, right? But in fact, when we start talking about exactly the things that we're praising or blaming, right, when we're actually applying the terms to specific instances, things go crazy, right? Things are all over the place. Nobody can seem to agree. And he says this is very different from matters of science or in or disagreements that are not about taste, right? So disagreeing about, for example, two different theories of, two different astronomical theories, or, metaphysical theories. Or I was reading today, right, thinking about the next video on Descartes, right? Descartes, there's two different theories about how the blood circulation worked, right? It's either the muscle in the heart contracts and that's what pumps the blood, or Descartes has this other idea that it's the heat that keeps the circulation going, right? So it's not the muscle of the heart. The muscle of the heart is actually reacting to the heat of the blood. And in that situation, right, when that dispute gets settled, right, first of all, that dispute can get settled, right? There is a right or a wrong answer. And very often when two people disagree in those kinds of matters, it's resolvable, right? Where, as long as you are observing the same things, as long as you have the same data, as long as you're using the words in the same way, right? As long as you're not having a merely verbal dispute or a semantic dispute, usually you can come to a resolution, right? And you're surprised that you had even been quarreling when at bottom you actually did agree, right? So how often does that happen? Two very smart people get in a disagreement and it turns out that they don't really disagree that much at all, right? This happens quite often. But not in matters of, whether Rick and Morty is a good show, right? Those debates are still ongoing, right? Okay. Let's go. Those who found morality on sentiment more than on reason are inclined to comprehend ethics under the former observation and maintain that in all questions which regard conduct and manners, the difference among men is really greater than at first sight it appears. Okay, so here he's like basically shorthand summarizing his moral theory, or his metaethics, I guess we should say. He is one of these who found morality on sentiment types, meaning that he believes that moral judgments are expressions of sentiments rather than matters of reason, or descriptions of the world like the sky is blue. I guess that's a very modern way of putting it. There are different versions of this theory that have been developed in the 20th century and beyond, but Hume is kind of one of the systematic offers a systematic approach to a morality based on sentiment. Right, meaning that basically that definition or that understanding of beauty as being praiseworthy and deformity as being blameworthy, right? He thinks that moral terms work like that in general. So moral and aesthetic judgments both have this same structure, right? And ethics, right? He's saying works the same way as disagreements of taste, right? He's not saying that ethics is purely a matter of taste, right? He's not like a radical subjectivist, like anything goes. And he's not a radical subjectivist, anything goes about matters of taste either. But he's got to build that argument, right? He's just saying in its general outline, in its structure, in the overall scheme of things, at least at the structural level, moral judgments, ethical judgments, and aesthetic judgments are kind of the same thing, right? They have a similar structure psychologically, right? And the same, right? We could run the same argument for ethics, right? Where the difference is really greater than it first appears. And he'll go on to give examples here, so I'm not going to come up with my own. I'll just rely on his, right? It is indeed obvious that writers of all nations and in all ages concur in applauding justice, humanity, magnanimity, prudence, veracity, and blaming the opposite qualities, right? So it's obvious that like everybody, every civilization basically has some sort of moral, some sort of system of values, right? Some sort of set of qualities, of actions or persons that we think are good, right, that we applaud, and others, which are usually the opposites, that we blame, right? So we talk about, justice in one context, in one culture, justice in another culture, right? They're both good things, even if the details differ, and that's what he's going to go on to talk about. But in general, the structure of these qualities, whether they're of a person, right, because a person can be just, or an action can be just, right? However it's applied, it is praiseworthy. It's something we want to applaud. And the opposite is stuff that we don't want to applaud, right? That we want to condemn or blame, right? So he's saying that like everybody has this, right? Everybody has this. Even poets and other authors whose compositions are chiefly calculated to please the imagination are yet found, from Homer down to Fenelon, to inculcate the same moral precepts and to bestow their applause and blame on the same virtues and vices. Right, so there's remarkable uniformity in at least the professed morals of different works of literature throughout the ages, right? From Homer down to Fenelon, who this, we got a little footnote here, Francois Fenelon, theologian, poet, writer, and he wrote The Adventures of Telemachus, son of Ulysses, right? So it's basically a fan fiction for the Odyssey, kind of, right? Like he tells the story of this character that appears in Homer's Odyssey, namely Odysseus' son, or Ulysses' son, if you're Latin, which like gets mentioned, and like this thing happens, and it's alluded to in the story, but it doesn't actually get the story doesn't get told in the Odyssey itself. So our boy Francois Fenelon sort of wrote his own fan fiction for what happened to Telemachus, right? And this is, why he's drawing the contrast here is because Homer first wrote this story, well, allegedly, right? We don't really know who Homer was or if he wrote anything or, what the deal is with where this story comes from, but regardless, it's obviously a few thousand years old and everybody still loves the Odyssey. And then we get, a modern take on the Odyssey by a modern writer. And, it still has this same moral flavor to it, right? Where there's things in both works that get presented that we want the audience to applaud, right? Behaviors that we think generally are good or praiseworthy. And there's other behaviors in the play or in the poem that are blameworthy, right? Things that we should, reject, right? This great unanimity is usually ascribed to the influence of plain reason, which in all these cases maintains similar sentiments in all men and prevents those controversies to which the abstract sciences are so much exposed. Right, the idea being here that, well, there's, plain reason, which I guess maybe is common sense, although I'm not sure. Sometimes in this context, common sense is a little more precise. But basically the idea is that, well, since our brains basically work the same way, there's like some bottom, base level uniformity in how we think, or in our appraisal of actions as being praiseworthy or blameworthy, right? And he says, well, as far as that goes, since we have similar sentiments, we're going to agree on some stuff. That's fine, right? So far as the unanimity is real, this account may be admitted as satisfactory. But we must allow that some part of the seeming harmony in morals may be accounted for from the very nature of language. Okay. So now he's blaming language here. The word virtue, with its equivalent in every tongue, implies praise, as that of vice does blame. And no one, without the most obvious and grossest impropriety, could affix reproach to a term which in general acceptance, is understood in a good sense, or bestow applause where the idiom requires disapprobation, right? So basically, he's saying that, it's not just the fact that we all have the same sentiments, it's that we know how to use language, right? We know that if we see something as virtuous, if something is called virtuous, if we deem something virtuous, then we know that that's a thing that we're supposed to praise. And it would be weird if we see something called virtuous, see some action referred to as virtuous, and then, give it a thumbs down, blame it, think that it's bad. All right, so to go back to the murder example, right? If we saw a murder and said, that murderer is so bad, we don't want to applaud, right? That would be weird. That might be evidence that we don't really know what's the difference between good and bad, right? Or if we see something virtuous and we don't have the accompanying, inclination to praise that action, we might not know what virtue means, right? It would be weird, right? So it's not just the sentiments, it's language itself that attaches certain words to certain expected appraisals of either praise or blame, right? Homer's general precepts, where he delivers any such, will never be controverted. But it is obvious that when he draws particular pictures of manners and represents heroism in Achilles and prudence in Ulysses, he intermixes a much greater degree of ferocity in the former and of cunning and fraud in the latter than Fenelon would admit of. Right? So now he's doing some sort of literary criticism here. He's saying that, when Homer depicts Achilles and Odysseus or Ulysses, they're kind of like, they're not really all that virtuous in a modern sense, right? They're not saintly figures by any means. They're cunning Odysseus, and Achilles a violent murderer, right? In the context of a war, of course, but he's a warrior, right? He kills a lot of people, right? He's ferocious, right? And Ulysses or Odysseus is cunning, and he lies. He's sneaky, right? And Fenelon, the modern, or a would-be modern version of the same story, right? Or a story in the same universe, right? It's fan fiction after all. Doesn't portray these characters quite as viciously, right? He sort of modernizes them and gives them, slightly more, modern, or at least 18th century French sentiments, right? The sage Ulysses in the Greek poet seems to delight in lies and fictions, and often employs them without any necessity or even advantage, right? So Odysseus just lies all the time, right? Just lies for fun. There's not even any benefit to it, at least in the original context. And the Greeks were okay with this, right? And in fact, maybe they even thought it was good. They thought it was a sign of his intelligence, right? Cunning Odysseus, after all. But his more scrupulous son, meaning Telemachus, in the French epic writer, namely Fenelon, exposes himself to the most imminent perils rather than depart from the most exact line of truth and veracity, right? Meaning that, the son, Telemachus, as being portrayed in Fenelon's writing, would rather, put himself in great danger than tell a lie, right? So obviously, this new version of the story places a higher premium on honesty in the hands of the French writer than was the case in the Greek writer. Okay, so these things change over time, right? So again, the point is, even though, right, the structure, again, of moral judgments is roughly the same. It's about figuring out what to praise and blame. And in general, we all have words that we think, these things should be praised, these things should be blamed. We all have, in a rough or thin sense, the term virtue, which means things we should praise, right? When we get down to the details, very often we see these terms in literature and other, cultural artifacts. We see these things applied in ways that don't really match up with the things that we praise and blame nowadays, right? Even though it's part of the definition of virtue that it be praiseworthy, right? So virtue in the ancient Greek sense is not necessarily virtue in the French, 18th century French sense. Or sorry, I guess 17th century. I forgot. Fenelon is 100 years or so Hume's senior. Okay, this paragraph is a doozy, so I'll do my best here. The admirers and followers of the Al-Quran insist on excellent moral precepts interspersed throughout that wild and absurd performance. Okay, the Al-Quran is the Quran. So he's talking about Islam right now. And of course, Hume is a Scottish, white dude, philosopher from Scotland in the 17th century, or 18th century. So, he doesn't have quite the nicest things to say, but, it is what it is. But he's making a point, so we'll just bear with him, right? But it is to be supposed that the Arabic words, which correspond to the English, equity, justice, temperance, meekness, charity, were such as, from the constant use of that tongue, must always be taken in good sense, meaning we have to assume that when we see these terms in the Quran, right, or in English translations of it, it means, they also carry that connotation of things we should praise, right? Equity, justice, temperance, meekness, charity, and so on and so forth. They're also things we should praise, and they should roughly correspond to the same sets of praiseworthy action, right? But maybe it doesn't, right? And that's the thing. And it would have argued the greatest ignorance, not of morals, but of language, to have mentioned them with any epithets beside those of applause and approbation, right? So clearly, when the authors use the English equivalents of equity, justice, temperance, meekness, and charity, when any author does, we have to assume that they know what those things mean, that they know that those things should refer to praiseworthy actions, right? But would we know whether the pretended prophet had really attained a just sentiment of morals? Let us attend to his narration, and we shall soon find that he bestows praise on such instances of treachery, inhumanity, cruelty, revenge, bigotry, as are utterly incompatible with civilized society. No steady rule of right seems there to be attended to, and every action is blamed or praised so far only as it is beneficial or hurtful to the true believers. Right? So basically, I mean, this is not a politically correct example, of course, and don't worry, he's got mean things to say about the Catholics at the end, right? So we'll get to the Catholic bashing, but right here he's just making the example, and you can fill in any made up tradition that you like to soften the point a bit, I guess. But the idea is just that very often we find people who use words like justice and charity and moral vocabularies, where the assumption is that you're supposed to praise things, you're supposed to praise these words or the actions that they're applied to, but they're applied to the wrong sorts of things, at least compared to modern sentiments, right? So there's this disconnect between, moral judgments being expressions of praise, right? Using words that sort of elicit or that indicate that you should have that sort of expression of praise, and then the application of those words to certain actions or activities or persons who might not, upon further reflection or in light of a specific description of what they're doing, actually call for praise in that case, right? So that's just the general example he's trying to give here. A bit unfortunate example in the current year, but, it is what it is. Okay, the merit of delivering true general precepts in ethics is indeed very small. Whoever recommends any moral virtues really does no more than is implied in the terms themselves. So this is interesting. The people who invented the word charity and use it in a good sense inculcated more clearly and much more efficaciously the precept, be charitable, than any pretend legislator or prophet who should insert such a maxim into his writings. Of all expressions, those which, together with their other meaning, imply a degree of either blame or approbation, are the least liable to be perverted or mistaken. Okay. Okay, so what he's saying here, I take it, is that, when we use moral terms, we're implying that we're implying a precept, basically. We're implying a command. We're implying be charitable when we say charity, right? We're implying that others should share this judgment too, right? So when we, how do I explain this without just reading what he said, right? Because his English is it's perfect because he's a native speaker, but it's almost so clear that it's hard to even paraphrase. But the idea is just that if you use the word charity the right way, you don't have to tell people to be charitable, because you're just going around praising charitable things. And by implication, anyone who watches people use the word charitable in daily life, obviously you should be charitable because everybody praises things that are charitable, right? Charity is obviously a good thing. It's obviously a good trait because everybody praises it, right? To be charitable is to do something that is worthy of praise, right? So you don't need to tell people to be charitable, right? You don't need to have a maxim that says be charitable, or to claim that to be charitable is morally good is a true moral statement, or tell people be charitable as a maxim. If you just know what the word charity means and you use it in the appropriate way, that's all you really need to do, right? So that's why he says that the merit of delivering true general precepts in ethics is indeed very small. Again, all this stuff comes in his what do you call it, the enquiry on the principles of morals, right? He runs, he has arguments for the why he thinks about moral philosophy this way, right? So why he thinks that morality has a firmer grounding and more uniformity, and more universal appeal, or more universal applicability compared to aesthetic judgments. He's got a bunch of arguments for this, and here he's just sort of alluding to this much bigger moral philosophy project that he carries out in other writings. But he's just it's like a borderline throwaway line in the context of this. But he's mentioning it because, again, judgments of taste and moral judgments have the same structure. They're both expressions of, they're not, maybe expressions is the wrong word, but they're their commitments to praise or blame certain actions. That's sort of what makes moral judgments what they are, and that's what makes judgments of taste what they are, right? And he's saying that moral standards sort of appear, well, they have their own story, and he thinks that there is a story there. That's why the title of the work is The Enquiry Concerning the Principles of Morals, right? So moral principles arise. They do happen, right? Where there's a way of systematizing our moral judgments, our judgments of praise and blame, and our use of moral vocabularies, right? There's a way of generating standards for that stuff, right? There's a way of generating standards for, or principles for moral judgments, for morals, right? So we're saying even though moral judgments are the same as judgments of taste in principle, moral judgments do have their own set of standards that we can, make judgments about, and successfully, reject, obviously, bad uses of moral vocabularies, right? Now we go to taste, right? It is natural, therefore, for us to seek a standard of taste, a rule by which the various sentiments of men may be reconciled, at least a decision afforded, confirming one sentiment and condemning another, right? So he says, well, if that works for morality, then we should try and figure that out for taste, right? We should try and figure that out for aesthetics, for judgments of, what's good and bad on Netflix, right? If there's a way it works for morality, there should be a way that it works for, evaluating art. Okay. There's a species of philosophy which cuts off all hope of success in such an attempt and represents the impossibility of ever attaining any standard of taste. Right. So now he's setting up an opposing view that says there's no standard of taste. Right. I don't know exactly what view he's referring to. Maybe I guess like subjectivism or relativism or some sort of radical, maybe idealism. I don't know exactly, but that's the view, right? The difference, it is said, is very wide between judgment and sentiment, and all sentiment is right, because sentiment has a reference to nothing beyond itself, and is always real, wherever a man is conscious of it, right? So the idea is, all sentiments are genuine, because anything about, judgments about the way you're feeling are always true, so long as you actually have those feelings, and those feelings aren't really, the feelings themselves aren't true or false or right or wrong, right? At least according to this view, they're sort of independent of reason altogether, right? So all sentiment is right because the sentiment has a reference to nothing beyond itself, and it's always real whenever you're conscious of it, right? But all determinations of the understanding are not right because they have reference to something beyond themselves, to wit, real matters of fact, right? So I can't be wrong about the fact that I'm in pain right now, as long as I actually am in pain, but I can be wrong about, what time it is or what the weather is like outside, right? Why is that? Well, because the thought in that case refers to something outside of myself, right? It refers to something in the real world rather than just to something that I'm feeling, right? Right, because they, right, determinations of the understanding, have a reference to something beyond themselves, to real matters of fact, and are not always conformable to that standard, right? And we get things wrong sometimes. Among 1,000 different opinions which different men may entertain of the same subject, there is one, and but one, that is just and true, and the only difficulty is to fix and ascertain it. Right. Right. So there's disagreement about matters of fact. Right. Eventually, we can get to the bottom of it. Right. We can figure it out. We can identify, what's the truth about the matter of how the heart circulates blood. Right. Or the relationship between the circulation of the blood and the heart, and the role of the heart in circulating the blood and things like that. There is a matter of fact about that. Right. And once we figure it out, right, we can align our beliefs with the way the world actually is, and we get things right, right? On the contrary, 1,000 different sentiments excited by the same object are all right, because no sentiment represents what is really in the object. It only marks a certain conformity or relationship between the object and the organs or faculties of the mind. And if that conformity did not really exist, the sentiment could never possibly have being. Beauty is no quality in things themselves. It exists merely in the mind which contemplates them. And each mind perceives a different beauty. So in other words, beauty is in the eye of the beholder, right? That's basically the position he's setting up here to be argued against, right? He's not accepting this position. He's just expressing it as an option, right? As a way that people think about this, which he disagrees with. One person may even perceive deformity where another is sensible of beauty. And every individual ought to acquiesce in his own sentiment without pretending to regulate those of others. So, everybody's sentiment, everybody who thinks that, whatever the opinion may be, which is just an opinion or a sentiment, is just the relationship between, some stimuli and your perception, right? The organs that's perceiving that stimuli, whether it's a smell or a sight or a taste or whatever. And that relationship, right, is always first person, personal, and true. Because that relationship is always directly perceptible to the person experiencing it. And for that reason, anything you say about it is true, right? If I say, that doesn't taste good, I don't have to add, it doesn't taste good to me, right? It's implied. And anything I say about the way something tastes to me is going to be true, right? Because it's always true, because it's true for me. At least when we're talking purely about matters of taste or sensibility, right? Again, this isn't Hume's view. This is just one way that people were thinking about the relationship between judgments of understanding and reason on the one hand, where there is a matter of fact, and judgments of taste on the other, or sentiment, where there isn't a matter of fact. There's no way that reason can adjudicate whether, a certain wine tastes good, or certain kinds of food taste good, or a certain kind of art is beautiful, or, a certain time of day is best, or whatever, right? So those kind of matters of taste are irresolvable, right? We can never hope to find any or adjudicate anything about them. And the reason for that is that they don't refer to anything beyond themselves, right? There's no standard for them to conform to, unlike beliefs about the world, where there is a standard for them to conform to, namely, some fact about the world. Okay. To seek in the real beauty or real deformity is as fruitless an inquiry as to pretend to ascertain the real sweet or bitter. According to the disposition of the organs, the same object may both be sweet and bitter, and the proverb has justly determined it to be fruitless to dispute concerning tastes, right? Right, so sometimes, depending on our mood, right, depending on whether or not we're sick, stuff tastes different, right? Some things taste good to us when we're sick, or, I don't know if you've ever had COVID and you lose your sense of smell. Some things, that used to smell good don't smell like anything anymore. And that's, just symptomatic of the way that our perceptions work. They change over time. And because of that, it's kind of hopeless to try and find an objective or true standard by which to judge things as, beautiful or good smelling or praiseworthy in the realm of taste, right? It is very natural and even quite necessary to extend this axiom to mental as well as bodily taste, and thus common sense, which is so often at variance with philosophy, especially with the skeptical kind, like Hume's, is found, in one instance at least, to agree in pronouncing the same decision. Right? So he's just saying, it's not just sweet and bitter, right? The senses, physical senses. It's also appreciating art, right? What's the best thing on Netflix or whatever, right? But though this axiom, by passing into a proverb, seems to have attained the sanction of common sense, there is certainly a species of common sense which opposes it, at least serves to modify and restrain it, right? So he says, even though it seems like, there's commonsensical reasons to accept that, look, because everybody just has different opinions about stuff and how they perceive things. They have different tastes. People have different preferences. That seems like common sense, right? But at the same time, there's another sort of common sense that vehemently rejects this sort of anything goes, beauty is in the eye of the beholder attitude, right? And he gives, here goes that. Here we go. Whoever would assert an equality of genius and elegance between Ogilvy and Milton, or Bunyan and Addison, would be thought to defend no less an extravagance than if he had maintained a molehill to be as high as Tenerife, or a pond as extensive as the ocean. Okay, so this is an analogy with a bunch of references that nobody understands because we're not 18th century Englishmen. Basically, Ogilvy, bad writer. Milton, good writer. Bunyan, bad writer. Addison, good writer. Right? And the idea is that, it would be weird for somebody to say, oh yeah, this clearly bad writer is just as good as this clearly good writer. Or they're equally geniuses. Or this clearly bad writer is just as good or just as much of a genius as this clearly good writer. Or this molehill is just as big as this giant mountain. Tenerife is the biggest of the Canary Islands and home to several tall mountains, including this one, which is 12,000 feet above sea level. Or a pond as extensive as the ocean, right? So there seem to be, right, even though there's a great diversity of taste among the general population, right, even though that seems to be true, there seems to be consensus about certain judgments of taste, where there seem to be pretty broad consensus. Broad, so much so that it would be weird if people disagreed about it, right? Like if anybody said that, well, yeah, if Ogilvy is as good as Milton, right? Milton, who wrote Paradise Lost, right? Versus Ogilvy, who I don't know, I'm not an expert on this stuff, but apparently he was a writer and author and translator of sorts, but then after his death, his writing sort of fell out of favor, and a lot of critics gave him a hard time because his poems weren't so good, I guess, right? But it's somebody who would have been known to not be nearly as good as Milton. We'll leave it at that, right? So this kind of consensus, Hume thinks, upsets this beauty is in the eye of the beholder kind of attitude, right? Because there is some consensus among judgments of taste, and those are worth taking seriously. Okay. Though there may be found persons who give their preference to the former authors, right, to Ogilvy and Bunyan, no one pays attention to them, right? Anybody who says that, Ogilvy is better than Milton, Bunyan is better than Addison, or I don't know, can I come up with modern examples that aren't controversial? Probably not. It's so hard to make this argument without savaging somebody. Maybe I'll think of one. But regardless, in terms of literary quality or quality of acting or I don't know. Oh, okay. The Room, right? Tommy Wiseau, right? Tommy Wiseau in The Room versus, I don't know, a Tom Cruise, right? Who's an excellent actor, right? If anybody says that Tommy Wiseau is a better actor than Tom Cruise, you're gonna say, probably don't need to trust that person's judgment, really, in the grand scheme of things, right? And that's Hume's point, right? There seems to be consensus, right? Even though there's a lot of diversity, there also seems in some cases to be quite a bit of consensus. And if people depart from that consensus, we kind of ignore them, right? And we pronounce without scruple the sentiment of these pretended critics to be absurd and ridiculous, right? The principle of the natural equality of tastes is then totally forgot, right? Meaning the principle of beauty is in the eye of the beholder is then, we just throw it out the window. And while we admit it on some occasions where the objects seem near an equality, it appears an extravagant paradox, or rather a palpable absurdity, where objects so disproportionate are compared together, right? So, the room compared to Titanic, right? So beauty is in the eye of the beholder, right? All judgments are equal, right? We could think that, when we're dealing with really hard cases, and it's like, oh, well, I prefer, Avatar 1 to Avatar 2. It's like, oh, no, I think the second one was good, or whatever, right? There's cases where, at least in roughly equivalent medias, where the objects seem near equality, that we could say, well, beauty's in the eye of the beholder. We don't all have to like everything. But it gets really weird if people start saying things like, oh yeah, no, The Room is better of a movie than Titanic or something, right? Or, maybe there's like an ironic sense where somebody might say, oh yeah, The Room is like more entertaining or whatever. But like by any standard reasonable metric, Titanic is a masterpiece, and The Room is not really in the same ballpark. And I feel like most reasonable people would agree on that. And even if not that specific example, there are examples like that in the real world where we can say, yeah, like most people with, a fairly reasonable set, or with reasonable judgment, would agree that, A is better than B, or X is better than Y. The Titanic is better than The Room, or whatever, right? And then at that point, we don't think beauty is in the eye of the beholder. We're much more skeptical of that, right? It is evident that none of the rules of composition are fixed by reasonings a priori, or can be esteemed abstract conclusions of the understanding, from comparing those habitudes and relations of ideas which are eternal and immutable, right? So this idea that the rules of composition, or rules of any sort, can be learned a priori is one of the tenets of rationalism, basically, right? So here he's just like setting up an argument against rationalism, which would be the idea that, well, a rationalist response to the standards of beauty would be, well, there are some a priori principles of beauty that must be respected in all, or that are respected in all instances of beautiful objects or things, right? So I think there's some scholastic definitions of beauty in the canon somewhere, where beauty is like unity, symmetry, uniformity, right? And there are other concepts that sort of get derived from the concept of beauty, which comes from the concept of God, or the concept of the good, right? Or there's some way of deducing what makes a painting beautiful without actually, looking at any paintings, right? That's what it means to be a priori, right? So sort of from principles alone, right? Without actually going out into the world and experiencing anything, you can deduce what it means to be beautiful, or what something needs to be beautiful. So Hume is saying that doesn't work, right? Clearly it doesn't work. So he's just like setting up and knocking down this rationalist position, right? Their foundation is the same with that of all the practical sciences: experience, right? So again, this is Hume the empiricist, right? So this doesn't work, right? The a priori stuff doesn't work for beauty. It's got to be experience, right? The empirical world. nor are there anything but general observations concerning what has been universally found to please in all countries and in all ages, right? So if we want to figure out the standards of taste, right, the standards of beauty, and get around this paradox, right, between beauty is in the eye of the beholder, and yet we all seem to have standards, right? We're not going to identify those standards, right? Namely, those standards that help us decide that, Titanic is good and The Room is not so good, or whatever. Those standards are not going to be deducible from first principles a priori, right? The only way we're going to get them is through experience, namely by finding general observations about what has universally been found to please in all countries and in all ages, right? So what is the lowest common denominator for all things that are praised in matters of taste, right? All works of art that are praised throughout history, throughout the world. That's the question, right? So this is Hume setting up an empiricist way of approaching the standards of taste, right? Many of the beauties of poetry and even of eloquence are founded on falsehoods and fiction, on hyperboles, metaphors, and an abuse or perversion of the terms from their natural meaning, to check the sallies of the imagination and to reduce every expression to geometrical truth and exactness would be the most contrary to the laws of criticism, because it would produce a work which by universal experience has been found the most insipid and disagreeable. Right, so this is again sort of arguing against the rationalist picture. If you remember from my Descartes video on Discourse of Method from a while back, or maybe a couple weeks back, Descartes loved that geometric truth, right? He loved the idea of going through the world with rational certainty of everything, as certain as people who do geometry are certain that a squared plus b squared equals c squared, right? That level of truth and exactness to figure out and identify what are the true standards of beauty in the world, right? And Hume is just saying that will never work, right? That's never going to work. And if it did, it would produce stuff that's just boring, right? It's just boring, right? Because the best stuff is messy, right? The best works of art are messy and, fictional and false and subversive and interesting and exciting, right? It's not as... So basically, this rationalist method is not going to be helpful, right? But though poetry can never submit to exact truth, it must be confined by rules of art, discoverable to the author either by genius or observation, right? So, this is kind of the idea of genius has an interesting role, and I guess, Hume is a bit before the Romantic period, but the idea of the genius, right? Somebody who's a genius who just thinks about the world and produces works in ways that are just totally different from, a normal person, right? That's a category compared to observation, which is the way that everybody else does it, right? You practice and you learn things and you observe and you get better over time, right? If some negligent or irregular writers have pleased, they have not pleased by their transgressions of rules or order, but in spite of these transgressions, they have possessed other beauties which were comfortable to just criticism. And the force of these beauties has been able to overpower censure and give mind to a satisfaction superior to the disgust arising from the blemishes. Right, so there are rules of art, and if some people squeak through the crack or slip through the cracks, right? If some people end up breaking the rules, but then producing stuff that people like anyway, it's because they're following other rules, right? Right. So there's other rules that they are following that they're doing well, and because they're following those rules, that's why that's where there's wide acceptance of them, right? So he's basically trying to defend against the worry that, well, if there are rules for art, then why does some art get really popular, and why do people seem to love art that breaks those rules? And Hume's response is, well, they don't break all the rules. There have to be some rules that they're following if a work of art is to be widely accepted, right? Ariosto pleases, but not by his monstrous and improbable fictions, by his bizarre mixture of the serious and comic styles, by the want of coherence in his stories, or by continual interruptions of his narrations, right? So clearly Hume doesn't like this Ariosto work. He charms by the force and clearness of his expression, by the readiness and variety of his inventions, and by his natural picture of the passions, especially those of the gay and amorous kind. Right, so, I didn't change that formatting. Sorry. Ludovico Ariosto, he was an Italian poet, and he wrote this book, Orlando Furioso, which was like somebody else started a poem and he finished it. And I think it was a poem about like Charlemagne. And it's basically a satire of chivalry, of the chivalric tradition. And it's very interesting, and it shows, well, it's a work of satire, right? So it's crass at times and things like that. So it's not well, I mean, it is high-minded, but it wouldn't have been considered that. It would have been scandalous, I guess, at the time. It was satire, right? And Hume is saying, well, yeah, satire, right, it's got all this stuff and it's really bad, but it's got this other really good stuff too, and that's why we read it, right? That's why it's so well liked, right? And however his faults may diminish our satisfaction, they are not able to entirely destroy it. Did our pleasures really arise from those parts of his poem which we denominate faults, this would be no objection to criticism in general. It would only be an objection to those particular rules of criticism which would establish such circumstances to be faults and would represent them as universally blamable. Right? So again, right, even if the poem breaks some rules, there's still going to be some rules that it's following, and we all acknowledge that it's following those rules and it's breaking these other rules, right? And it's not like it's not a problem for that to be the case, right? Criticism, literary criticism, art criticism is a thing. People do it. It happens all the time, and people can look at different respects in which an art, a work of art is good in this respect, and it's not so good in this respect. It does a really good job with this, but it's really, not so good with this, right? So there's different categories. There's different ways in which art can follow some rules and break other rules. And that is not a threat at all to this idea that there are standards for taste, right? If they are found to please, they cannot be faults. Let the pleasure which they produce be ever so unexpected and unaccountable. Right? I think it should be lest the pleasure which they produce be ever so unexpected and unaccountable. Right? Right, there has to be a reason to why people find certain works of art universally pleasing or generally pleasing, even if not universally, and those can't be the faults. Right? There can be faults in a work of art, but that's not why we like them, right? We like them for the other things that they do well. Okay, but though all the general rules of art are founded only on experience and on the observation of the common sentiments of human nature, we must not imagine that on every occasion the feelings of men will be conformable to these rules. Those finer emotions of the mind are of a very tender and delicate nature, and require a concurrence of many favorable circumstances to make them play with facility and exactness according to their general and established principle. What the hell does that mean? I guess the idea here is that, people... Okay, now he's setting up the idea that even if there are general rules, it's not just that works of art can, be reliant on these rules for their success in spite of breaking some of them, right? That's one way that that art can, follow general rules in a way that's kind of odd and tricky, but also our perception of art with respect to those rules can be influenced and disrupted, right? So he's going to start to say some things about how we might be influenced and not successfully evaluate works of art appropriately, right? Right, because the finer emotions of the mind are very delicate and tender, right? So basically, it's hard to cultivate the kind of sensibility you need to judge art, right? It's hard to do. It's tricky, and a lot of people are not very good at it. But this doesn't mean that beauty is in the eye of the beholder and there are no rules, right? Just because it's hard doesn't mean there are no standards, right? That's what I think. That's what's going on, or he's setting that up definitely. Okay. The least exterior hindrance to such small springs, or the least internal disorder, disturbs their motion and confounds the operation of the whole machine. When we would make an experiment of this nature and would try the force of any beauty or deformity, we must choose with care a proper time and place, and bring the fancy into a suitable situation and disposition. A perfect serenity of mind, a recollection of thought, a due attention to the object. If any of these circumstances be wanting, our experiment will be fallacious, and we shall be unable to judge of the Catholic and universal beauty. Right. So again, we need to be really careful when we make aesthetic judgments, because they are conforming to standards, but very often our judgments don't follow those standards because we are distracted by something. We're in the wrong state of mind. We can't make a fair appraisal of something because we are influenced by something that affects our ability to appraise a work of art, right? And so we have to, do an experiment, right? Namely, when we appraise something as beautiful or not, we have to do so in a controlled environment, right? In the right sort of conditions, right? You'd never be able to truly enjoy a concert or an orchestra performance if, someone's talking in your ear the whole time, or if it's on a computer screen rather than live in person, right? I mean, computer screens, you can enjoy, a concert well enough on YouTube, but it's not the same as going in person, of course, right? And that's all he's saying here, right? That the work needs to be done to make sure that we're appreciating the thing in the right sort of way to arrive at a suitable judgment. Okay, the relation which nature has placed between the form and the sentiment will at least be more obscure, and it will require greater accuracy to trace and discern it. We shall be able to ascertain its influence not so much from the operation of each particular beauty as for the durable admiration which attends those works that have survived all the caprices of mode and fashion, all the mistakes of ignorance and envy. Okay, so what he's basically saying here is that when we identify the rules or the standards of taste, it's not going to be like every time we look at something individually, it's going to conform perfectly to the rules, right? These rules are basically empirical generalizations, right? And this goes back to the point in the previous paragraph too about some works of art follow rules in one respect and they don't follow in another respect. They break some rules and they follow some others. We're going to be in situations where our minds are focused on something, or we're too preoccupied with something that, our own judgment doesn't really capture the standard, or why this work of art is in accordance with the standard or not, right? So our perceptions aren't going to be perfect in each instance. Instead, we're going to identify the standards on the basis of their overall general conformity after many experiments, after many instances of looking at different works of art in various different circumstances, as controlled as we can. Right? So it's basically it's an empirical method for identifying the general trends, the general standards by which we typically, in the right sort of environment, tend to judge art, right? From the durable administration of, the artistic experience or the viewing of art, right? And that's where we find the standards, right? So here he gives an example, right? The same Homer who pleased at Athens and Rome 2,000 years ago is still admired at Paris and London. All the changes of climate, government, religion, and languages have not been able to obscure his glory. Authority or prejudice may give a temporary vogue to a bad poet or orator, but his reputation will never be durable or general. When his compositions are examined by posterity or by foreigners, the enchantment is dissipated, and the faults appear in their true colors. On the contrary, a real genius, the longer... Oh, sorry. Why did I do that? On the contrary, a real genius, the longer his works endure, and the more widely they are spread, the more sincere is the admiration which he meets with. Right. So the idea here is that if you want to find, well, again, the standards of beauty or the standards of art, you have to look at the stuff that has the best track record over time, right? It's not going to be like a one-off thing where, like, in a perfect environment, one person examines a work of art or a poem and decides, oh yeah, this one meets the standard, this one is up to snuff. No, it's going to be determined by, whether or not it still draws a crowd 2,000 years after it was written, right? Will the Mona Lisa still draw a crowd in another 1,000 years? If it does, then maybe, then there's a pretty good chance that whatever's going on in the Mona Lisa follows some sort of standard for works of art, right? It's doing something right, right? Same with like the Iliad and the Odyssey, right? The fact that those stories are so enduring and people love them so much for so many centuries and millennia, really, that's really good evidence that it's pretty solid, right? That it's a real work of art. The fact that it's got this universal, enduring appeal throughout history. Compare that to something that, something that's more of a flavor of the week, right? Something that's just, maybe mediocre, right? It appeals only to a very limited sentiment for a limited period of time, and doesn't really transcend and meet that higher, more enduring standard of artistic worth. That's a sign that that's going to be something more mediocre compared to something more enduring, right? So this idea of enduring over time and following a general, repeated praise is really good evidence of a standard of beauty or a standard of art at work, right? That's the idea. Envy and jealousy have too much place in a narrow circle, and even familiar acquaintance with his person may diminish the applause due to his performances. But when these obstructions are removed, the beauties which are naturally fitted to excite agreeable sentiments immediately display their energy, and while the world endures, they maintain their authority over the minds of men, right? So even if there's some independent reason to not like a particular artist, right? If the work is really good, if it's of that high quality, if it is, and this is part of it, if what is produced is naturally fitted to excite agreeable sentiments, right? That's the standard. Then it will be enduring, right? Then it meets that standard, right? If you create something that it's almost as if it was made to excite or to cause praise or happiness or whatever in people, then that's going to be the standard, right? It's as if, sugar, the relationship of sweetness between our tongues and sugar, right? we can say as if sugar was made to be perceived as sweet by us, right? We want works of art that were made as if they were designed to be appreciated and applauded and praised by us, right? And works of art are, right? They are created to be appreciated by an audience. And the best works of art accomplish that the most over time, in the most circumstances, over the longest periods of time, and as if they were naturally fitted to excite agreeable sentiments, right? So that's a lot of how this is going to work. Okay. It appears then that amidst all the variety and caprice of taste, there are certain general principles of approbation or blame, whose influence a careful eye may trace in all operations of the mind. Right, so the general principles of praise and blame. Right? Some particular forms or qualities from the original structure of the internal fabric are calculated to please, and others to displease. And if they fail of their effect in any particular instance, it is from some apparent defect or imperfection in the organ. Okay, so he's saying that in really great works of arts, where they're designed to fit or meet the general standard, to fit the general principle of being such that anybody who sees this, anybody who reads this, anybody who observes this is going to enjoy it, is going to praise it, is going to think it's good, no matter their situation. And if they don't, it's because there's a problem with the person, right? There's a defect or imperfection in the organ itself, right? So this is like kind of a logical implication of the fact that there are standards, right? So he's sort of like stipulating, like there has to be standards of taste, right? There just has to be. It's got to be out there, because look at something like Homer, right? If there's not a standard of taste, then how on earth do people still enjoy the Odyssey and Homer, right? How has that stuck around? How has that been so enduring if there is no standard of taste that Homer is meeting, right? And if somebody goes along and says, well, I don't really like Homer, then, probably it's a problem with that person's judgment, right? Logically, right? Because if there are standards, and if certain works of art have been proven to meet those standards, then any failure to appreciate that that work of art does meet the standard has to be with, the problem has to be with you, with the perceiver, rather than with the work of art itself, because it's already been proven to meet that standard, right? Well, there are things to say about that argument, but that's what he's giving, right? That's what he's saying here, right? And he goes on with an analogy to sort of defend this, right? Or to illustrate this, right? A man in a fever would not insist on his palate as able to decide concerning flavors, right? So when you're sick, you wouldn't go out and trust yourself to, taste food for a wedding banquet to decide, what to order, right? You wouldn't trust yourself to go out to dinner at a 5-star restaurant, aside from not wanting to get people sick. You wouldn't trust yourself to enjoy all the flavors because your tongue and your taste and your smell and your senses aren't working like they would under normal circumstances, right? Nor would one affected with the jaundice pretend to give a verdict with regard to colors, right? So jaundice messes up your messes up your eyesight, I guess. In each creature, there is a sound and a defective state, and the former alone can be supposed to afford a true standard of taste and sentiment, right? So when we're looking at the standard of taste and sentiment, we're trying to look at the normal standard sound functioning of the organ, namely the mind, that appreciates something as, beautiful, right? If, in the sound state of the organ, there be an entire or considerable uniformity of sentiment among men, we may thence derive an idea of the perfect beauty. In a like manner, as the appearance of objects in daylight to the eye of a man in health is denominated their true and real color, even while color is allowed to be merely a phantasm of the senses, right? So he's talking about basically intersubjectivity here. This term gets more used in Kant, but the idea is that even though the perception of color, the perception of beauty, the perception of taste is a first-person subjective experience, because of the way human nature is, right? Because of how uniform human nature is, because of our similarities as human beings, we are wired in such a way to perceive the same thing in the real world in the same way under normal conditions, right? So if we all go outside on a clear day and we look at grass, it should be green. And we're all going to look at that and say, yep, that's green. It's the same color as, the leaves on trees. And that's what we mean by green under these conditions, right? In normal circumstances, right? If we were to look at the same grass, during a sunset or in the middle of the night, the grass is not going to be green. It's not going to, hit our eyes as green, if at all, right? In the dark, right? Then we don't see anything. Grass is black in the dark, right? Everything is black in the dark, right? But at the same time, we allow that there are standards, right? Even though it's a first-person subjective experience, it changes from day to day. It relies on specific conditions being met in order for it to actually appear to us in the way that we determine is the standard. But there is, after all, a standard that we agree on. And he's saying that, the standard of taste is going to work like that, right? Under normal conditions, right? Over time and, after many, many iterations, it seems to be that Homer provides a pretty good standard of, a great poem, right? A beautiful poem, a good poem. It meets the standard of taste, right? Homer's Iliad and Odyssey, right? Many and frequent are the defects in the internal organs, which prevent or weaken the influence of those general principles, on which depends our sentiment of beauty and deformity. Though some objects, by structure of the mind, be naturally calculated to give pleasure, it is not to be expected that in every individual the pleasure will be equally felt. Particular incidents and situations occur which either throw a false light on the objects or hinder the true from conveying the imagination the proper sentiment and perception, right? So again, just sort of, covering his ass here, he say, look, this doesn't mean, right, just because there are standards of beauty doesn't mean that everybody's always going to see them, doesn't mean that they will always be recognized. It doesn't mean that every time something gets played or used or seen that everybody's going to agree, or that they're going to all be equally moved by the piece of music or by the work of art or whatever it might be, right? There's all sorts of ways that our perception could be altered or hindered, right? And he's going to talk about a couple of these. But nevertheless, this doesn't threaten the idea that there is a standard, right? There is a standard. There is clearly grounds for agreement in matters of taste. And how do we know that? Well, because we do have widespread agreement in matters of taste on many works of art, right? On many matters of taste, there is widespread agreement. And he's saying that the structure of that agreement follows a lot of the same structure as the rest of our sensory agreement, right? A lot of the same of our agreement on our experience of the world, where even though we all have our own individual experience, there are situations in which we have enough agreement about the facts of the situation otherwise that make us confident that such and such is blue, such and such is a certain color, such and such is of a certain quality, such and such has a certain taste, right? And things like that. So that's the way it's going to have to work. And again, just like in the case of perception, there's going to be all sorts of reason why we disagree and why this standard isn't perfectly respected or adhered to. That's just the nature of the beast. Okay, one obvious case why many feel not the proper sentiment of beauty is the want of the delicacy of imagination, which is requisite to convey a sensibility for those finer emotions. This delicacy everyone pretends to. Everyone talks of it. It would be reduced, and it would reduce every kind of taste or sentiment to its standard. But as our intention in this essay is to mingle some light of the understanding with the feeling of the sentiment, it would be proper to give a more accurate definition of delicacy than is hitherto attempted. And now not to draw our philosophy from too profound a source, we shall have recourse to a noted story in Don Quixote. Right, so now he's going to talk about Don Quixote. Right, but what's he saying in that paragraph? Well, he's saying that one way that people's fail to appreciate standards in beauty is that they don't have delicacy of imagination, right? So what does that mean, delicacy and imagination? Because you need the delicacy and imagination to, listen to a beautiful symphony or see a beautiful work of art and say, I really appreciate this. You need delicacy of imagination. Now, we don't really know what that means yet, but he's saying that you do need it. And he's going to explain it by reference to Don Quixote. Okay. We'll give it a shot. It is with good reason, says Sancho to the squire with the great nose, that I pretend to have judgment in wine. So he pretends to have a judgment in wine. This is a quality hereditary in our family. Right, so, Don Quixote pretends, Sancho pretends to be able to he pretends to be a wine snob, right? He pretends because it's everybody else in his family can discern different vintages and different flavors or different types of wine, I guess, right? Two of my kinsmen were once called to give their opinion of a hogshead, which is kind of wine, which was supposed to be excellent, being old and of a good vintage. One of them tastes it, considers it, and after mature reflection pronounces the wine to be good, were not for a small taste of leather, which was perceived in it. And if you know anything about wine tasting, people use all sorts of strange descriptors for different kinds of tastes of wine. It's sour, it's dry, it's earthy, it's fruity, and in this case it tastes, it has a little leather taste, a leathery taste. Oh, okay. It doesn't sound good, but it's something that maybe a discerning wine connoisseur could sniff out, right? The other, after using the same precautions, gives also his verdict in favor of the wine, but with the reserve of a taste of iron, which he could easily distinguish. You cannot imagine how much they were both ridiculed for their judgment, right? So people were laughing at them, like, what are you talking about? This hogshead doesn't have a leathery taste, doesn't have an iron taste. That doesn't make any sense, right? You can't. And you guys are supposed to be like wine connoisseurs. You guys are supposed to know what you're talking about when it comes to tasting wine, and you're saying these ridiculous things. But who laughed in the end? On emptying the hogshead, there was found at the bottom an old key with a leather thong tied around it, right? So there you go. There was a reason for the leathery taste and the iron taste. After all, there was a key with a little piece of leather attached to it in the wine bottle. So there you go. That's where it came from. Okay. There's a moral to that story, and I think he's going to explain it, so I don't have to. Do I? Maybe. Well, I think the story is clear enough, but just to briefly go over, right? The idea is that they were judging under perfect conditions, and yet they came to different conclusions where, first of all, they disagreed with each other, And then there was a third group who wasn't tasting the wine with them, who was making fun of them for having, seemingly ridiculous conclusions of this earthy or leather taste. But it turns out that they were right, because there was like a bit of leather and a key, which is a piece of iron, in the wine. So they were right. They were right about it. And that's, I guess, the humor in there. I didn't do a great job of explaining that, but there you go. I think humor turns to it, right? That's not the only thing he says about that. Okay. The great resemblance between mental and bodily taste will easily teach us to apply this story. Though it be certain that beauty and deformity, more than sweet and bitter, are not qualities in the object, but belong entirely to the sentiment, internal or external, it must be allowed that there are certain qualities in objects which are fitted by nature to produce those particular feelings, right? So again, it was weird for the two guys drinking the wine to taste leather and iron until we discovered that there was a key made of iron and leather in the wine bottle. Because when we see that, then it makes sense why they would taste iron and leather. Because there's something made of iron and leather, and that is designed to produce, fitted by nature to produce the sensation of tasting iron or leather, right? So there's no mystery anymore, because there's a quality in the object that's, it seems like that quality is fitted by nature to produce that sentiment, right? Even though the sentiment itself isn't part of the object, right? So there is no taste of leather in leather itself, right? Leather doesn't taste itself, right? We taste the leather when we, for whatever reason, I guess chew on leather or whatever, right? Or have leather in our wine, I guess, right? And so that's what this line is saying here, right? And this is like worth repeating, right? Though it be certain that beauty and deformity, more than sweet and bitter, right? So sweet, like taste, beauty and deformity, just like taste, are not qualities in objects, but belong entirely to the sentiment, internal or external. It must be allowed that there are certain qualities in objects which are fitted by nature to produce those particular feelings, right? So it's as if they were designed to produce that. Now, as these qualities may be found in a smaller degree, or may be mixed and confounded with each other, it often happens that the taste is not affected with such minute qualities, or is not able to distinguish all the particular flavors amidst the disorder in which they are presented, right? So very often, when we taste or appreciate something that was designed to create a certain impression in us, we don't appreciate all the details, right? Very often we can't taste all the notes of a really complicated dish, or we can't see or notice or appreciate all the details in a work of art because we don't know the art history of the time period or whatever. We can't appreciate the story behind it, or we don't recognize the characters in a biblical depiction or something, right? So he's talking about being able to distinguish that stuff. When the organs are so fine as to allow nothing to escape them, and at the same time so exact as to perceive every ingredient in the composition, this we call delicacy of taste, whether we employ these terms in the literal or metaphorical sense, right? So this is delicacy of taste, right? When the wine connoisseur or the gourmet or the foodie can, dissect a dish while they're tasting it, right? And say, oh, I sense the saffron in there, and the notes of, you used green onion instead of regular onions, or there's a hint of nutmeg, right? I can taste that, right? A lot of people who don't know anything about cooking, or who don't have a very delicate, right, a delicate palate, that stuff they might just ignore it. They just say, oh yeah, it tastes good, right? It tastes good, right? But he's talking about delicacy of taste as a prerequisite for appreciating standards of beauty, because he's saying that's necessary, right? You can't appreciate the standards of beauty if you don't know the standards that are being met, right? If you can't perceive that stuff because you can't perceive that stuff, right? Here then, the general rules of beauty are of use, being drawn from established models and from the observation of what pleases or displeases when presented singly and in a high degree. And if the same qualities in a continued composition and in a small degree affect not the organs with a sensible delight or uneasiness, we exclude the person from all pretensions to this delicacy, right? So we can tell if somebody knows what if somebody has a delicate palate when it comes to any matter of taste, right? Whether it's identifying features of music or a song or a work of art or a dish, right? We can tell the difference between somebody with a delicate or refined palate and somebody with, who doesn't have one, who'll just say, oh yeah, it's good or bad, right? To produce these general rules or avowed patterns of composition is like finding the key with the leather thong, which justified the verdict of Sancho's kinsmen and confounded those pretended judges who had condemned them, right? So, when we identify the standard of taste, it's just like finding the key in the bottom of the wine bottle, right? It's the reason why those people with the refined palates, right, with the refined and delicate tastes, who knew that there was something in the wine that gave them that sensation. They identified it. They knew that there was something there that was causing them to taste iron and leather, and there was, right? They made a prediction, and there it was. It was there. And Hume is saying that standards of taste is like that, right? It's like that. It's like finding that thing, that element of the experience, that feature in the artwork that was designed to produce the intended effect, right, of praise, of enjoyment, of generally pleasurable sentiments, right? Though the hogshead had never been emptied, right, we didn't know for sure that the key was there, the taste of the one was still equally delicate, and that of the other equally dull and languid. But it would have been more difficult to have proved the superiority of the former to the conviction of every bystander, right? So, So even, so when the wine wasn't emptied and we didn't know for sure that there was a key at the bottom, right? When we didn't know that for sure, right, it would have been difficult to, justify those, the connoisseur's judgment, right? It would have been difficult to say, they must have a really refined palate, and if they say that it's beautiful, or that it's, that it has a leathery taste, or that an irony taste, then I guess it does, right? It would have been more difficult to prove the superiority of that judgment without actually emptying out the bottle and finding the key that, they were proved right. In like manner, though the beauties of writing have never been methodized or reduced to general principles, though no excellent models have ever been acknowledged, the different degrees of taste would still have subsisted, and the judgment of one man had been preferable to that of another. But it would not have been so easy to silence the bad critic, who might always insist upon his particular sentiment and refuse to submit to his antagonist, right? So again, the idea of having vast disagreement in matters of art, right, in writing, right? So he's trying to draw an analogy between this wine tasting example of people having this perception and knowing, having this correct perception that there was something in the wine that was leathery and irony, right? Even though they didn't know it until they emptied the bottle and saw it, versus people trying to claim that certain writing is, preferable, certain writing is good, certain writing is praiseworthy, compared to a bunch of critics who say that it's not. But when we show him an avowed principle of art, when we illustrate the principles by examples whose operation from his own particular taste he acknowledges to be conformable to the principle, when we prove that the same principle may be applied to the present case, where he did not perceive or feel its influence, he must conclude upon the whole that the fault lies in himself, and that he wants the delicacy which is requisite to make him sensible of every beauty and every blemish in every composition or discourse. Right? So in fact, appreciation of art is teachable, and bad critics can be corrected with sufficient, education in their delicacy of taste, right? In their refinement of their palate, right? And here's how you do it, right? You give them examples, and you say, look, you agree that this is beautiful, right? Yes, that's beautiful. Okay, well, this other thing is also beautiful, right? Would you agree with that? Yes, I do. Oh, here's the general principle why those two things are beautiful. Now, here's this third thing. Do you agree that that thing is beautiful? Well, yes, I do, because it follows the principle, and so on and so forth, right? And the more you do that, the more delicate, to use this technical sense, your palate will be, and the better you'll be able to perceive the standards of beauty, of taste. It is acknowledged to be the perfection of every sense or faculty to perceive with exactness its most minute objects, and allow nothing to escape its notice and observation. The smaller the objects are, which become sensible to the eye, the finer is the organ, and the more elaborate its make and composition. Right. So now he's just talking about the details of having a delicate or refined palate. Right. A good palate is not tried by strong flavors, but by a mixture of small ingredients, where we are still sensible of each part, notwithstanding its minuteness and its confusion with the rest. Right, so somebody who can identify that little bit of nutmeg in, the bolognese or whatever. Right. In a like manner, a quick and acute perception of beauty and deformity must be the perfection of our mental taste. Nor can a man be satisfied with himself while he suspects that any excellence or blemish in a discourse has passed him unobserved. Right. So, just like in, when you're tasting things, when you're tasting food, or observing art, or evaluating anything else that can be evaluated in terms of beauty or deformity. Right. In this case, the perfection of the man and the perfection of the sense or feeling are found to be united, right? So the idea is that it's something you can work on. You can work on your palate, right? You can train yourself to be more discerning and delicate in matters of taste. And this just seems true, right? Like, people are experts in taste on certain areas, right? Roger Ebert and movies, right? There are critics who we respect, whose opinions we respect, because they can notice things in a movie, in a show, in some bit of media, in a work of art. They can notice things that the normal person, right, who doesn't have as much experience, won't even notice, right? That's why we respect those critics, right? And this is obviously the case, right? Hume was writing in a time where there were all sorts of literary critics, right? Literary criticism was a very big thing. And forming literature and writing poems, right? And critiquing poetry and literature. This was a major intellectual activity of the time, and still is today, I guess. But that stuff happens. And because it happens, there needs to be a story for why some works are enduring, why some works persist over time, why some works are universally praised, other works are universally condemned, why some critics seem universally respected, right? Why some critics are often condemned and are often rejected, right? And so on and so forth. Right? There has to be some standards of taste at work, right? So this idea that beauty is in the eye of the beholder, even though it seems commonsensical because people disagree about everything, it seems contrary to common sense when we look at things like universal or widespread agreement in matters of taste, right? There needs to be a story for why that happens. Okay, a very delicate palate on many occasions may be a great inconvenience both to a man himself and to his friends, but a delicate taste of wit or beauty must always be a desirable quality, because it is the source of all the finest and most innocent enjoyments of which human nature is susceptible. Right? So beauty is great, right? In this decision, the sentiments of all mankind are agreed. Wherever you can ascertain a delicacy of taste, it is sure to be met with approbation. And the best way of ascertaining it is to appeal to those models and principles which have been established by the uniform consent and experience of nations and ages, right? So there's things you can appeal to, there's standards you can appeal to in order to refine and then demonstrate the refinedness of your palate, right? Okay. But though there be naturally a wide difference in point of delicacy between one person and another, nothing tends further to increase and improve this talent than practice in a particular art, and the frequent survey or contemplation of a particular species of beauty. When objects of any kind are first presented to the eye or imagination, the sentiment which attends them is obscure and confused, and the mind is, in a great measure, incapable of pronouncing concerning their merits or defects. The taste cannot perceive the several excellences of the performance, much less distinguish the particular character of each excellency and ascertain its quality and degree. Right, so the idea is you got to practice. Right? If you want to refine your delicacy and have access to assessing things and evaluating whether things are beautiful or whether works of art are good or whether movies are good or what's the best thing to watch on Netflix, you got to practice. You got to be exposed to lots of different things, because if you're only exposed to a couple things, you're not going to be able to discern the details of what makes, a really good movie if you've only seen like 2 or 3 movies, right? It's going to take a lot of practice, right? If it pronounced the whole in general to be beautiful or deformed, it is the utmost that can be expected. And even this judgment, a person so unpracticed will be apt to deliver with great hesitation and reserve, right? So if you just say, oh yeah, that movie's good, or oh yeah, that movie sucked, and like you leave it at that, that's not really very, reliable or good judgment, right? You need to, have a more discerning or delicate assessment of the different defects and merits of a piece, the different excellences of a performance, and the character of what makes each piece excellent or not. Right? But allow him to acquire experience in those objects, his feeling becomes much more exact and nice. He not only perceives the beauties and defects of each part, but makes the distinguishing species of each quality and assigns it a suitable praise or blame. A clear and distinct sentiment attends him through the whole survey of the objects, and he discerns that very degree and kind of approbation or displeasure which each part is naturally fitted to produce, right? So he figures out the parts of the movie or the film or the piece that are designed to produce the feeling of, foreshadowing, of dread, of joy, of whatever the case may be. The mist dissipates, which seemed formerly to hang over the object. The organ acquires greater perfection in its operations and can pronounce, without danger of mistake, concerning the merits of every performance. In a word, the same address and dexterity which practice gives to the execution of any work is also acquired by the same means of judging it, or by the same means in the judging of it. So yeah, just like anything else, it takes practice to develop a more refined and delicate palate. It just does. So advantageous is practice to the discernment of beauty that before we can give judgment of any work importance, it will even be requisite that that very individual performance be more than once perused by us and be surveyed in different lights with attention and deliberation. There is a flutter or hurry of thought which attends the first perusal of any piece, and which confounds the general sentiment of beauty. The relation of the parts is not discerned. The true characters of the style are little distinguished. The several perfections and defects seem wrapped up in a species of confusion and present themselves indistinctly to the imagination. Not to mention that there is a species of beauty which, as it is florid and superficial, pleases at first, but being found incompatible with a just expression, either of reason or passion, soon palls upon the taste, and then is rejected with disdain, at least rated at a much lower value, right? So the idea is that you have to you have to look at stuff more than once, right? You can't just make a judgment of beauty the first time you see a play or a show or a film or whatever. Like, if you really want to decide whether something is a true work of art, whether something is really up to the standard, whether something is really good, you have to view it more than once, right? You have to experience it more than once. Okay, it is impossible to continue in the practice of contemplating any order of beauty without being frequently obliged to form comparisons between the several species and degrees of excellence and estimating their proportion to each other. Right, so here's the other thing, right? You can't just practice viewing one work of art at a time individually, right? In order to refine your taste and to develop a more delicate palette, you need to make comparisons, right? You need to compare one thing to another, right? You need to compare one work of art to another, right? A man, and I do apologize for the gendered language here. This is 18th century Hume. It's all men all the way down. It's white dude philosophy. I don't know what to say. It is what it is, but I do apologize for it, and I cringe every time I read it on the inside. But it is what it is. A person who has had no opportunity of comparing the different kinds of beauty is indeed totally unqualified to pronounce an opinion with regard to any object presented to him. By comparison alone, we fix the epithets of praise or blame, and learn how to assign the due degree of each. The coarsest daubing contains a certain luster of colors and exactness of imitation, which are so far beauties, and would affect the mind of a peasant or Indian with the highest admiration. Right, so he's saying that, there's lots of stuff that is designed to impress at a superficial level that you don't really need to have like a whole lot of experience to like say, oh, I like that, right? Because it could be designed in such a way as to like just instantly create satisfaction. So think of like McDonald's, right? McDonald's is sort of like designed to please in a way, right? It's very fatty, it's very salty, it's got ingredients and chemicals that are designed to stimulate cravings and satisfy desires in our brains, right? Is it good? Right? Is McDonald's like, is it gourmet? Will it, is it like a work of culinary art? No, right? No, just no. It just isn't, right? So if somebody, who only eats McDonald's has like, I don't know, a cheeseburger, a gourmet cheeseburger one day and says, oh yeah, that's pretty good. That's not really the person whose judgment we really want to trust, right? We need somebody, if they're going to tell us, where's the best burger in town, we want somebody who's tried all the different burgers and who can make comparisons, right? Not just the person who's only ever eaten McDonald's, right? So that's the point he's making here, right? The most vulgar ballads are not entirely destitute of harmony or nature, and none but a person familiarized to superior beauties would pronounce their numbers harsh or narration uninteresting, right? So, the most vulgar ballads, think like, stuff on pop radio, right? Think stuff that you hear in the supermarket, over the radio in the car, right? Just pop songs, right? They're terrible, right? To people who know things about music, right? Or usually they're not very impressive to people who know things about music. And yet, they're agreeable, right? They're catchy. They do what they have to do. And only people who like know things about music have enough information or have enough knowledge to be really snobby about pop songs of the day, right? A great inferiority of beauty gives pain to a person conversant in the highest excellent of the kind, and is for that reason pronounced a deformity. And the most finished object with which we are acquainted is naturally supposed to have reached a pinnacle of perfection and to be entitled to the highest applause, right? I love that one. A great inferiority of beauty gives pain to a person conversant in the highest excellence of the kind, right? So, somebody who's like a total music snob is going to, listen to some pop song and just cringe and be miserable the whole time because it's just not up to their standard, right? Speaking from experience here, right? And it gives pain to people who understand the highest excellence, right? Which there is, according to Hume. There is a highest excellence. There is a standard of beauty, right? And this is how we get to it, right? By way of human nature, having a shared experience of the same phenomenon, having certain phenomena being designed to produce agreeable feelings within us when we perceive them under the right conditions, and when our own perceptive abilities are delicate enough and trained well enough, practiced well enough, and form enough adequate comparisons that we can discern the different features in a piece or in a work of art to determine its beauty. Okay. One accustomed to see and examine and weigh the several performances admired in different ages and nations can only rate the merits of the work exhibited to his view and assign its proper rank among the production of genius, right? So only somebody who's seen a lot of stuff, who's, observed a lot of evidence, is qualified to determine, that something is really beautiful, right? That's what it takes. But to enable a critic the more fully to execute this undertaking, he must preserve his mind free from all prejudice. He must preserve his mind free from all prejudice and allow nothing to enter into his consideration but the very object which is submitted to his examination, right? So it requires focus, right? If you really, for a critic to really determine if something is beautiful or good or not, you got to be totally focused on it. We may observe that every work of art, in order to produce its due effect on the mind, must be surveyed in a certain point of view, and not be fully relished by a person whose situation, real or imaginary, is not conformable to that which is required by the performance, right? So we have to do what the author wants us to. We have to get into the mindset that the author intended for us to do, right? We have to watch the play as a member of the audience, right? The stage performance is designed to impress people in the audience, right? You can't just watch it from a mile away or just hear it from backstage, right? That's not going to give you the full impression of the play. You have to watch it the right way, right? An orator addresses himself to a particular audience. It must have a regard to their particular genius, interests, opinions, passions, and prejudices. Otherwise, he hopes in vain to govern their resolutions and inflame their affections, right? So, works of art are fitted to audiences and to particular contexts, right? That's the claim. Should they even have entertained some prepossessions against him, however unreasonable, he must not overlook this disadvantage, but before he enters upon the subject, must endeavor to conciliate their affection and acquire their good graces, right? So an artist has to respond to the desires and needs of the audience, right? A critic of a different age or nation who should peruse this discourse must have all the circumstances in his eye and must place himself in the same situation as the audience in order to form a true judgment of the orator or of the oration, right? So the idea there is that, if we really want to understand or critique or determine whether a work of art is great or beautiful, we have to also put ourselves in the shoes of the people in the particular context, right? In the audience of the time, right? The context of being a member of the audience of the time, right? So even though there is this universal appeal for many great works of arts, in order to really appraise them effectively, a great critic will be able to understand the audience that work of art was originally intended for. Okay. In like manner, when any work of art is addressed to the public, though I should have friendship or enmity with the author, I must depart from this situation, and considering myself as a man in general, forget, if possible, my individual being and my peculiar circumstances, right? So we want to strip away all of our prejudices, and even though if we think the author is an asshole or whatever, right? We want to get rid of all that stuff and just look at the work of art by itself, right? A person influenced by prejudice complies not with this condition, but obstinately maintains his natural position without placing himself in that point of view which the performance supposes. If the work be addressed to persons of a different age or nation, he makes no allowance for their peculiar views and prejudices, but, full of the manners of his own age and country, rashly condemns what seems admirable in the eyes of those for whom alone the discourse was calculated, right? So when we anachronistically, reject as, silly or bad works of art that were designed or created in a different time period, then we're not really being good critics, right? We're not really, understanding or appreciating the different standards of taste if we do that, right? We have to sort of put ourselves in the audience's shoe, or in the audience's shoes, understand the audience that the work of art was created for, and, eliminate our prejudices that we have in our daily life, right? Otherwise, we're a bad critic, right? We're a person influenced by prejudice, right? If the work be executed for the public, he never sufficiently enlarges his comprehension or forgets his interest as a friend or enemy, as a rival or commentator. By this means, his sentiments are perverted, nor have the same beauties and blemishes the same influence upon him as if he had imposed a proper violence on his imagination and forgotten himself for a moment. So far, his taste evidently departs from the true standard, and of consequence loses all credit and authority, right? So this is an explanation of, right? So he's basically trying to explain diversity of opinion, at least to a certain extent, as people failing to fully utilize their natural and proper capacity for evaluating works of art, right? So the reason that people disagree over whether, Homer is a great work of art is because there's a lot of people who are like this, right? Who approach works of art with prejudice, right? And if they would only, get rid of their prejudice, put themselves in the shoes of the audience for whom the art was designed and things like that, if only they would do that, then they would agree that it is a great work of art. And the reason that it is a great work of art, or the evidence that it's a great work of art, is that it's been appreciated by so many people who maybe don't do this, but maybe do like some of this, but nevertheless enough people agree and evaluate the thing as a work of art, as a great work of art. And there's enough agreement, right, throughout the general population over centuries and even millennia that this is a great work of art, that we know that it meets the standard, right? We know that it meets the standard. But the reason that people disagree and that there seems to be so much disagreement on matters of taste is because people are improperly using their organs of taste, right? Which is like, this is a crazy elitist argument, isn't it? Like it's we don't, there's lots of ways we could assess this argument, but that's the view, right? If you don't like it, it's your problem, right? That's basically what Hume is saying. If you don't like Homer, go do some reading, go learn about Greek history, go put yourself in Homer's shoes, and eventually you'll get it, right? You keep trying, you'll get it. And you will, if you try hard enough, you will appreciate Homer eventually, right? That's what he's saying. And if you don't appreciate Homer, then you're just not using your brain right. That's all there is to it. Okay. So we shouldn't take those people seriously, right? That's just like somebody who says that The Room is better than the Titanic. It is well known that in all questions submitted to the understanding, prejudice is destructive of sound judgment and perverts all operations of the intellectual faculties. It is no less contrary to good taste, nor has it less influence to corrupt our sentiment of beauty. it belongs to good sense to check its influence in both cases. And in this respect, as well as in many others, reason, if not an essential part of taste, is at least requisite to the operations of this latter faculty. In all the nobler productions of genius, there is a mutual relation and correspondence of parts. Nor can either beauties or blemishes be perceived by him whose thought is not capacious enough to comprehend all those parts and compare them with one another in order to perceive the consistence and uniformity of the whole. Okay, so he's saying that, like, yes, prejudice is bad, and we have this stuff called good sense or reason that helps us identify when we're being prejudiced, and you know, it's our brain's way of identifying things that might get in the way of the full exercise of our standard of taste, right? So we have a couple things now, right? It's we need, if we want to cultivate our standard of taste, we need delicacy, right? We need delicacy. Where is it? It's way up here, right? Delicacy of imagination. We need refined. We need a refined palate. We need a delicate palate. We need to be able to identify the subtleties of a piece and identify its excellent qualities and its not so excellent qualities. We need that. How do we get that? Well, we have to practice, right? We have to practice. Where does it go? Well, it's up there somewhere. We need to practice. We need to review different works of art over long periods of time and form our judgments in accordance with standards, and we need to practice that. And then eventually our judgments will get more delicate. Along that way, we need to do comparisons, right? We need to compare works of art. We need to not just look at each work of art in its own situation or in and of itself, but we need to compare different works of art and decide, okay, this one's good in that respect, not good in that respect. It's good in this respect, but not good in that respect. And this other one over here is good in these other respects, but it's not so good in that respect, and so on and so forth. We need to form comparisons. And then we need to free ourselves of prejudice, right? And how do we do that? Well, we utilize what's called good sense or reason, right? Every work of art has also a certain end or purpose for which it is calculated, and is to be deemed more or less perfect as it is more or less fitted to attain this end, right? So every work of art has a purpose or an end or a goal, right? The object of eloquence is to persuade, of history to instruct, of poetry to please by means of the passions and the imagination, right? So actually this is a particular theory of art that Hume is going with here, which is sometimes called pragmatism, although it's not pragmatism of the, like, you know, American philosophy type. Is it pragmatism? I think it's called pragmatism. Oh, I forget. It's embarrassing. I'm pretty sure it is. But anyway, the point is this, right? The idea is that the goal of art is to elicit some reaction in the audience. That's the purpose, right? And that's just one theory of art. The idea that, you know, you make a work of art so that the audience will feel like X, right? It's designed to do something. It's designed to generate a response in the audience, right? And there's different theories of art too, right? So another theory of art, which goes back to Aristotle, is that art is supposed to imitate reality, right? Art is mimesis. It's about mimicry. It's about imitation of reality. And the extent to which it does that, the extent to which art captures an element of reality, that determines whether it's good art or bad art, right? This view, which says that art is supposed to induce some sort of reaction in the audience, this is actually pretty strongly associated with the geographical area that Hume is coming from, that kind of, I don't know, 16th, 17th century literary criticism. This idea was pretty popular. I wish I'm suddenly doubting the name. I'm pretty sure it's pragmatism, but I could be forgetting the name. The other major form of art, or the major art theory that we get shortly after the modern period, is expressionism, which is the idea that art is designed to just express the overflowing of emotions. And this comes from a lot of the English poets went with this theory of art, like William Wordsworth, for example. I think he's like wrote the book on this theory of art. So whether or not you take Hume seriously here might depend on your theory of art, and the theory of art that he's presenting here is by no means, universally accepted, but it is one that was probably prominent, or that was prominent in his day. Right, so the object, so that art has a goal, right, and the goal of poetry is to please by means of the passions and the imagination. These ends we must carry constantly in our view when we peruse any performance, and we must be able to judge how far the means employed are adapted to their respective purpose. Besides, every kind of composition, even the most poetical, is nothing but a chain of propositions and reasonings, not always, indeed, the justest and most exact, but still plausible and specious, however designed or however disguised by the coloring of the imagination. The persons introduced in tragedy and epic poetry must be represented as reasoning and thinking and concluding and acting suitably to their characters and circumstances, and without judgment, as well as taste and invention, a poet can never hope to succeed in so delicate an undertaking. So what's he saying here? I don't know. He's just talking about what makes good art, I guess, right? He's talking about the standards themselves now, right? What makes good poem? What makes a good poem? It's got to be realistic, I guess. It's got to accomplish its goal, right? Not to mention that the same excellence of faculties which contributes to the improvement of reason, the same clearness of conception, the same exactness of distinction, the same vivacity of apprehension, are essential to the operations of true taste, and are its infallible concomitants. It seldom or never happens that a man of sense who has experience in any art cannot judge of its beauty, and it is no less rare to meet with a man who has just taste without a sound understanding. Okay, right, so he's talking about the value of good sense here, of rationality. So he's basically saying you need to be a smarty pants to understand good art. That's basically what he's saying, right? That's the idea here, that you got to be smart, you got to be critical, you got to be a clear thinker, you have to understand stuff, you have to be, of a certain mental caliber, a certain level of refinement, a certain ability to divest yourself of prejudices and put yourself in, another situation and appreciate all the different details of the context and the goal and the purpose of each different episode within a broader work of art, within a broader play or whatever. Right? You got to be able to do all that stuff if you're going to be a good critic, basically. That's what he's saying. Because if you don't have a developed, rational ability, you'll never be able to notice this stuff. And all this stuff is essential for good works of art. So this is why he says, right, it seldom or never happens that a man of sense, right, so smarty pants, right, somebody who's smart and rational, who has experience in any art, cannot judge of its beauty. And it's no less rare to meet a man who has a just taste, right, who has a good sense of taste, without also a good understanding of it, right? Okay, cool. Here we go. Thus, though the principles of taste be universal, right? So he's saying the principles of taste are universal. Right? They're universal principles of taste. And nearly, if not entirely the same in all people, all men. Yet few are qualified to give judgment on any work of art or to establish their own sentiment as the standard of beauty, right? So this is, he wants to get here, right? This is where he wanted to get at the beginning, right? He says, look, everybody disagrees about art and matters of taste, but at the same time, there seemed to be widespread agreement within matters of art and taste as well. How does that happen? How can we get to that situation, right? How can there both be standards of art, which many people seem to agree on, but also many people seem not to respect? How do we get to that situation? What explains that situation? And this is it, right? This is it. The principles of taste are universal, and basically the same in everybody because we're all wired the same. We all have human nature. We're all built the same way, and we all perceive the same stuff. So, the principles of what, makes us tick, of what's appealing to us, is going to be pretty much the same. Just like, everybody likes sweet stuff. Everybody likes salty stuff. Everybody likes fatty stuff. Everybody likes beautiful works of art, right? That's the analogy that's supposed to be. And yet few are qualified to give judgment on any work of art or establish their own sentiment as the standard of beauty, right? Why? Because they fail to do all that stuff that he just mentioned, right? They don't practice. They don't use their good sense. They don't have a delicate and refined palate. They don't form enough comparisons. They don't have a comprehensive enough understanding of the situation. They're prejudiced, right? Things like that. That's what explains the diversity of views. The organs of internal sensation are seldom so perfect as to allow the general principles their full play and produce a feeling correspondent to those principles, right? It's rare to come to a situation where you can really, confidently allow your judgment to sort of do its thing, right? It's difficult to get to that situation. They either labor under some defect, are vitiated by some disorder, and that by means excite a sentiment which may be pronounced erroneous, right? So we're distracted, or we're affected by something. We have something else on our mind. Something happens. We have a personal relationship with the author or the artist or whatever, right? There's all sorts of reason why our standard of taste can be thrown off, right? And why we might end up with an impression of a work of art. Maybe we were just in a bad mood, right? And we might not be able to appreciate a work of art as intended, right? When the critic has no delicacy, he judges without any distinction, and is only affected by the grosser and more palpable qualities of the object. The finer touches pass unnoticed and disregarded. When he is not aided by practice, his verdict is attended with confusion and hesitation. When no comparison has been employed, the most frivolous beauties, such as rather merit the name of defects, are the objects. The most frivolous beauties, such as rather merit the name of defects, are the object of his admiration. So basically, like the stuff that doesn't matter is what he's focused on and treats as beautiful, even if it's not. Where he lies under the influence of prejudice, all his natural sentiments are perverted. Where good sense is wanting, he is not qualified to discern the beauties of design and reasoning, which are the highest and most excellent. Right. So this is why people end up disagreeing about art that they should agree about. Is because this stuff is happening, right? All that stuff. No delicacy, no practice, no comparison, prejudices, no good sense, right? Under some or other of these imperfections, the generality of men labor. So most people are affected by one or more of these imperfections, right? One or more of these problems. They're not delicate. They don't have any practice with the objects of art. They don't form comparisons. They're prejudiced, right? Most people are subject to one or more of these issues. And hence a true judge in the finer arts is observed, even during the most polished ages, to be so rare a character. Strong sense, united to delicate sentiment, improved by practice, perfected by comparison, and cleared of all prejudice, can alone entitle critics to this valuable character. And the joint verdict of such, wherever they are to be found, is the true standard of taste and beauty. Okay, cool. So that's where he wants to go. Right? How there is a standard of beauty, it's just really, really high, right? It's a really high standard. It's really tough because most people are affected by one or more of these imperfections. And it's really rare to find somebody who's not. But when you do find that person who's really, refined, delicate, unprejudiced, well-versed, lots of practice, forms lots of comparison, right? Like a full-time movie reviewer, right? Like a Roger Ebert type person, or I don't know, Mike and Jay from Red Letter Media, right? Those guys are great, right? They like fit a lot of the, like they don't seem to be affected by many of these prejudices, and there's like a couple of them. So like it's, they have to agree with each other, right? So there's like, even less prejudice because they don't agree with each other all the time. And there's like, disagreements come out and are enlightening in ways, right? So they're like, we're really good critics, right? But they're rare. They're rare, right? And those alone are the true standard of taste and beauty, right? So we found the standard of taste, right? Congratulations. There we go. That's it. That's the moral. That's where he wanted to go, and that's where he went. So now we've theoretically identified what it takes to be a critic who possesses a true standard for taste and beauty. So what are we doing from here on out? Well, but where are such critics to be found? That's the question. And by what marks are they to be known? How to distinguish them from pretenders? These questions are embarrassing and seem to throw us back into the same uncertainty from which, during the course of this essay, we have endowed to extricate ourselves. Right? So this is all well and good, right? We've identified who has the true standard, theoretically, but how do we do that in practice? Right? How do we identify people who are, the true critics, right? Who have the true standards of beauty? How do we do that? Well, Hume's going to tell us. But if we consider the matter aright, these are questions of fact, not of sentiment. So, that's good. If it's matters of fact, then we can be right or wrong about them. Matters of sentiment, it's a little trickier. Right? We have to rely on empirical generalities based on human nature and the relationship between sentiment and the objects that give rise to sentiment and all that other stuff, right? But when we're dealing with facts, now it's a little clearer. Whether any particular person be endowed with good sense and a delicate imagination free from prejudice may often be the subject of dispute and be liable to great discussion and inquiry, right? But that such a character is valuable and estimable will be agreed in by all mankind. Where these doubts occur, men can do no more than in other disputable questions which are submitted to the understanding. Right? So the understanding, not the sentiments, right? To reason. They must produce the best arguments that their invention suggests to them. They must acknowledge a true and decisive standard to exist somewhere, to wit, real existence and matter of fact. And they must have indulgence to such as differ from them in their appeals to this standard. They must have indulgence to such as differ from them, in their appeals to this standard, right? It is sufficient for our present purpose if we have proved that the taste of all individuals is not upon an equal footing, and that some men in general, however difficult to be particularly pitched upon, right, however difficult it is to find them, will be acknowledged by universal sentiment to have a preference above all others. Okay, so basically, we should be able to find these people, is what he's saying. We should. And it should be something we can discover, right? Because we're not talking about constructing the theoretical artifice. We're talking about finding people with particular qualities that pretty much everybody would agree are good qualities. But in reality, the difficulty of finding, even in particulars, the standard of taste is not so great as it is represented. Okay, so it's easier than we thought. That's good. Though in speculation we may readily avow a certain criterion in science and deny it in sentiment, the matter is found in practice to be much more hard to ascertain in the former case than in the latter. Okay, so science is harder than sentiment. Theories of abstract philosophy, systems of profound theology have prevailed during one age. In a successive period, these have been universally exploded. Their absurdity has been detected. Other theories and systems have supplied their place, which again give place to their successors. And nothing has been experienced more liable to the revolutions of chance and fashion than these pretended decisions of science. The case is not the same with beauties of eloquence and poetry. Okay, so he's saying, this is a fun argument. He's saying that basically science changes pretty often, right? Theories that we thought were totally rock solid and not going anywhere, have been replaced time and again. And the theories that replaced them have also been replaced. We went from Aristotle to Newton, and then from Newton to Einstein, and now from Einstein to like quantum stuff, I guess. I don't know my physics that well anymore, but like I'm pretty sure that's the story, right? And I'm sure we'll have something else in another 50 years. I don't know, maybe string theory will get off the ground, although probably not. But like, he's saying that science changes all the time. But the same is not the case with beauties of eloquence and poetry. Just expressions of passion and nature are sure, after a little time, to gain public applause, which they maintain forever. Just expressions of passion, right? So he's saying like beauty, right? Just expressions of passions and nature, right? Meaning beautiful works of art, right? Just expressions of passion and nature are sure, after a little time, to gain public applause, which they maintain forever. Right, so like Homer, been around forever, right? But to the contrary, right, Aristotle and Plato and Epicurus and Descartes may successfully yield to each other, but Terence and Virgil maintain a universal, undisputed empire over the minds of men. The abstract philosophy of Cicero has lost its credit, but the vehemence of his oratory is still the object of our admiration. Okay, so he's saying that it's actually probably easier to identify people with good taste because works of art that are good, that people with good taste can identify, those works of art last forever. And they always have that enduring, permanent value as great works of art, right? And because those things persist through time, it's easier for people to identify those things using the proper standard of taste, right? So that's, I guess, the argument here. Is it true? I don't know. I'm a little skeptical of this, actually, right? I mean, like, I think that art changes with each generation too, and I think that, like, I don't know, Virgil, the Aeneid, like, I've never read that. But Hume would say, well, then, you clearly haven't done enough work. You have to go and read your epic poetry and, your Western Civ and learn all that stuff. And when you do, you'll agree that it's amazing, right? That it's excellent, that it's a great work of art. And maybe that's true. But you're not going to read Plato and Aristotle and suddenly think that, Aristotle's physics is correct, right? You're not going to do that. You might appreciate Aristotle as a work of art, right? As a literary work, as a window into the ancient world, but you're not going to suddenly think that his physics is correct. So he's like trying to find a disanalogy there and say that, well, it's easier for us to assess works of art than, works of science, or like the world of enduring works of art is more stable than the world of science and reason. I guess that's what he's trying to say. That's a nice point. I don't know. He might be right. Though men of delicate taste are rare, they are easily to be distinguished in society by the soundness of their understanding and the superiority of their faculties above the rest of mankind. I wonder if Hume thinks of himself as one of these individuals, right? Probably. The ascendant which they acquire gives a prevalence to that lively approbation with which they receive any productions of genius, and renders it generally predominant. Many men, when left to themselves, have but a faint and dubious perception of beauty, who yet are capable of relishing any fine stroke which is pointed out to them. Right? So he's saying that we can learn to be good critics. Right? Every convert to the administration of the real poet or orator is the cause of some new conversion. And though prejudice may prevail for a time, they never unite in celebrating any rival to the true genius, but yield at last to the force of nature and just sentiment. Thus, though a civilized nation may easily be mistaken in the choice of their admired philosopher, they never have been found long to err in their affection for a favorite epic or tragic author. So again, he's just sort of saying that it seems like there's more consistency in our judgments of poetry and art appreciation than there are in our judgments of, science and philosophy. That might just be false, but I don't know. He's I see where he's coming from. Okay. But notwithstanding all our endeavors to fix a standard of taste and reconcile the discordant apprehensions of men, there still remain two sources of variation which are not sufficient indeed to confound all the boundaries of beauty and deformity, but will often serve to produce a difference in the degrees of our approbation and blame. So again, he's saying that there should be uniformity here. Right? There should be uniformity in these judgments, right? In across artistic judgment, and saying, look, everybody who knows anything, who has thought about it long enough, who has enough experience, is going to say that Homer is great, right? You just are. And if you don't, it's because you're not using your brain right, basically, right? I'm shaking my head. I'm saying, that's a little weird. I don't know about that. But he's going to explain why. What is the source for why it seems like judgments about art do vary tremendously over time, right? Why does that seem to happen anyway? And he's given two sources of variation, right? The one is the different humors of particular men. The other, the particular manners and opinions of our age and country, right? So he's going to say people are different, and that explains some of the variation, and the customs and opinions of the era in which you're living. That's another source of variation, right? The general principles of taste are uniform in human nature, right? So that's a big thesis, right? That's a big part of his project. Where men vary in their judgments, some defect or perversion in the faculties may commonly be remarked, proceeding either from prejudice, from want of practice, or want of delicacy, right? We've gone over this. And there is just reason for approving one taste and condemning the other. But where there is such diversity in the internal frame or the external situation as is entirely blameless on both sides and leaves no room to give one the preference above the other, in that case, a certain degree of diversity in judgment is unavoidable, and we seek in vain for a standard by which we can reconcile the contrary sentiments, right? So he's explaining, even though human nature is uniform and we should arrive at this ideal situation, there are some things that happen, there are some differences between human beings, and there are some external factors in society at large that make that impossible, right? That make it so maybe we can't come to an agreement about a standard, right? So here's the other examples, right? A young man whose passions are warm will be more sensibly touched with amorous and tender images than a man more advanced in years, who takes pleasures in wise philosophical reflections concerning the conduct of life and moderation of the passions. So at 20, Ovid may be the favorite author, Horace at 40, and perhaps Tacitus at 50, right? So basically, your tastes change throughout your lives, right? I don't like the same shows that I liked 10 years ago, and I don't like the same shows that I liked 20 years ago, and in another 30 years, I might not like the same shows that I like right now, and things like that, right? That seems obvious, right? Vainly would we, in such cases, endeavor to enter into the sentiment of others and divest ourselves of those propensities which are natural to us. We choose our favorite author as we do our friend, from a conformity of humor and disposition, mirth or passion, sentiment or reflection, whichever of these most predominates in our temper, it gives us a peculiar sympathy with the writer who resembles us. Right? So now he's actually saying, one reason why it's so difficult to arrive at a standard of taste is because people have like different preferences that don't come from human nature, right? That aren't shared by everybody, but are particular to each person, right? So in a sense, people do have different preferences, right? The beauty is, to some extent, in the eye of the beholder. There's room for that intuition, that bit of common sense in Hume's system, and it's right here, right? Is that there is a sense in which people do have natural variation, and that gives rise to a lot of disagreement, right? So let's keep going, right? One person is more pleased with the sublime, another with the tender, a third with raillery. I don't know what that is. One has a strong sensibility to blemishes and is extremely studious of correctness. Another has a more lively feeling of beauties and pardons 20 absurdities and defects for one elevated or pathetic stroke. The ear of this man is entirely turned towards the conciseness and energy. That man is delighted with copious, rich, and harmonious expression. Simplicity is affected by one, ornament by another. Comedy, tragedy, satire, odes, each has its partisans who prefer that particular species of writing to all others. It is plainly an error in a critic to confine his approbation to one species or style of writing and condemn all the rest. But it is almost impossible not to feel a predilection for that which suits our particular turn and disposition. Such preferences are innocent and unavoidable, and can never reasonably be the object of dispute, because there is no standard by which they can be decided. Right? So he's saying there is room within his theory for irresolvable disputes, like whether comedy is better than tragedy, or whether odes are better than epics, or whether, TV shows are better than movies, or whether books are better than TV shows, or, there are certain irreducible, incomparable disagreements that you can have within the world of taste that don't seem to rely on any, or don't seem to allow for any universal standard. And that just seems to be a fact of taste, of art, of the world. And that's it. There's no standard by which they can be decided. But this doesn't upset his, overall theory that human nature does give us uniformity of standards to a certain extent, right? There's some uniformity of standards, and it appears, in critics who are not subject to all those faults that we discussed before. Okay, but he is allowing for irreducible, irreconcilable disagreement. For a like reason, we are more pleased in the course of our reading with pictures and characters that resemble objects which are found in our own age or country than with those which describe a different set of customs. It is not without some effort that we reconcile ourselves to the simplicity of ancient manners and behold princesses carrying water from the spring and kings and heroes dressing their own victuals. So now he's talking about the variation at the cultural level and how this affects and upsets our ability to form sound judgments in accordance with the standard of taste as determined by human nature, right? We may allow in general that the representation of such manners is no fault in the author, nor deformity in the piece, but we are not so sensibly touched with them. For this reason, comedy is not easily transferred from one age or nation to another. Yes, right? So comedy doesn't age very well, right? If you watch a comedy from the 70s or a comedy from the 50s, I bet you won't laugh, right? Maybe like Airplane is still good after, 40 whatever years, but like a lot of comedies do not age very well. And Hume is telling us why, right? Where, because you need to share values to have comedy, and values change with the age, is basically what he's saying. Whereas tragedy usually touches on things that are more universal, more transcendent throughout the ages, and that's why those deep emotional connection, people, loved ones dying, betrayal, and things like that, these human emotions that are a bit more general and a bit more amenable to tragedy or drama, whereas comedy is a bit more circumstantial and situational. That's the idea. Right, and I should say, just to preface even more, so this, idea about our natural, right, like differences of we go through our lives, and at different ages in our lives we have different preferences, and sometimes we just have different preferences for different media, right? Like I like video games, some people like books, some people like movies, some people like TV shows, right? These differences cannot be like fixed with refinement, right? This is not a matter of refining the delicacy of our tastes, of doing more practice, of forming more comparisons, of getting rid of prejudice, right? This is not subject to that. This is sort of irreducible. This is just like the way things are, and this is like a permanent challenge to arriving at a standard of taste, right? It's not insurmountable, right? People do it. We do get past this stuff, and people people do form judgments that qualify as standards of taste, right? There are critics out there who can get through all this stuff, or who can successfully serve as standards for judgments of taste, even though all this is true, right? But this isn't really something that you work on, right? You don't work on having different preferences for different artistic mediums, right? That's not really an issue. And same here, right? We don't really work on, belonging to a different time period, right? That's just not really possible, right? We may allow in general that the representation of such manners, right, namely like, weird traditions from different historical periods or different cultures or whatever, right? We may allow in general that the representation of such manners is not fault in the author nor deformity in the piece, but we are not so sensibly touched with them, right? And this is why comedy is not easily transferred from one age to another. A Frenchman or an Englishman is not pleased with Andrea of Terence or Clizia of Machiavelli, where the fine lady upon whom all the play turns never once appears to the spectators, but is always kept behind the scenes, suitably to the reserved humor of the ancient Greeks and modern Italians. A man of learning and reflection can make allowance for these peculiarities of manners, but a common audience can never divest themselves so far of their universal ideas and sentiments as to relish pictures which in no wise resemble them, right? So, I guess the idea here is that a critic will be able to suspend their judgment to an extent compared to like the regular audience, right? So maybe a critic can, appreciate that, oh yeah, this is like a foreign French film. This wouldn't really be, regardless of, whether it's foreign French, but you can easily imagine a good critic, and like, Mike and Jay on Red Letter Media, right? They say this stuff all the time, where it's like, well, a normal movie-going audience might not like this, but here's why this is actually great. Here's why this is actually genius, right? Or here's why this is a really good moment or a really good scene, or this movie has this really good thing going for it, but a modern movie-going audience isn't going to go for that. People are going to be bored or whatever, right? Like this kind of thinking, this kind of criticism is the sign of a really good critic. So I guess a good critic can sort of get around that, but there's probably going to be limits. But here there occurs a reflection which may perhaps be useful in examining the celebrated controversy concerning ancient and modern learning, where we often find the one side excusing any seeming absurdity in the ancients from the manners of the age, and the other refusing to admit this excuse, or at least admitting it only as an apology for the author, not for the performance. Okay, so I guess there's this like controversy that like maybe we shouldn't be taking ancient poetry or literature very seriously at all, and we should just focus on stuff that gets produced in our own age, I guess. Or maybe like I guess it's like a how tolerant to be of like backwards ancient culture when we're evaluating art. Whether to evaluate art in spite of how alien the culture seems, or try our best to appreciate it in spite of how alien the culture may seem, or whether it's only possible to enjoy art if we have a certain level of connection to it, right? So I think that's the disagreement that's going on here. In my opinion, the proper boundaries in the subject have seldom been fixed between the contending parties. Where any innocent peculiarities of manners are represented, such as those above mentioned, they ought certainly to be admitted, and a man who is shocked with them gives an evident proof of false delicacy and refinement. The poet's monument, more durable than brass, must fall to the ground like common brick or clay, were men to make no allowance for the continual revolutions of manners and customs, and would admit of nothing but what was suitable to the prevailing fashion. So I think he's saying that, like, we have to sometimes, like, again, I think it's about getting rid of prejudice, but in a sort of extreme way, where we are, we're viewing works of art that have moral sentiments that are just totally at odds with the way we do things now, or that are just like totally offensive. All right, so like, I don't know, we have controversies about this nowadays, right? So whether or not to keep reading Huckleberry Finn in schools, right? Because there's some language in there that's really not acceptable these days, we'll say, and maybe not in any context. So maybe we shouldn't read those books anymore, right? But then other people say, no, it's good to those books are worth reading in spite of those flaws, right? Or what was the other example? Huckleberry Finn was one example, or like I don't know, reading or watching like John Wayne films or something, right? Or like racism in movies from like the 60s and 70s, right? Like where some of it's like really blatant and crass and like upsetting to watch. Violence against women in movies, right? Things like that, where like it's just totally offensive to modern moral sentiments. And the question is, well, should we still try to appreciate that stuff? And I guess this was a debate back in the 1700s too, because there would have been stuff that was like, morally acceptable when it was written, but is no longer, even though these works have endured over time. Right? And Hume says, must we throw aside the pictures of our ancestors because of the roughs and fartingales? I don't know what, I guess it's like a some sort of fashion, I would assume, right? Must we throw aside the pictures of our ancestors because of the roughs and fartingales, right? But where the ideals of morality and decency alter from one age to another, and where vicious manners are described without being marked with the proper characters of blame and disapprobation, this must be allowed to disfigure the poem and to be a real deformity. Okay, so he's saying we should be critical of the moral failures of works of art. We should. I think that's what he's saying here. I cannot, nor is it proper, I should, enter into such sentiments. And however I may excuse the poet on the count of the manner in his age, I can never relish the composition. So I guess you say, like, there's always going to be some sort of disconnect and some sort of critical, some sort of failure of communication or failure of appreciation when you're viewing something that is so morally opposed to what you're, the morality or ethics of the day, right? There's going to be some natural tension there, no matter what. You could never relish in the composition if, there's depictions of rape or murder or something, or something awful, some terrible crime that that isn't accompanied by the appropriate, outrage and disgust and horror, right? Where, if it's, or whatever the topic may be, right? The want of humanity and of decency, so conspicuous in the characters drawn by several of the ancient poets, even sometimes by Homer and the Greek tragedians, diminishes considerably the merits of their noble performances and gives modern authors an advantage over them. Right, so he's saying this is a limit of... So the actual moral condition of artists, as expressed in the art that they create, is in fact a detriment to the value of the art itself. Right? So he's saying, yeah, when we watch John Wayne movies, or we see women get hit in westerns from the 60s, we should cringe, and we shouldn't say like, oh, well, we shouldn't be able to appreciate those movies nowadays because morality has improved, right? Because society is more nice than it was 100 years ago or whatever, right? Right, we are not interested in the fortunes and sentiments of such rough heroes. We are displeased to find the limits of vice and virtue so much confounded. And whatever indulgences we may give to a writer on account of his prejudices, we cannot prevail on ourselves to enter into his sentiments or bear an affection to characters which we plainly discover to be blamable. So he's saying that's going to be a natural limit to our ability to successfully evaluate enduring works of art. Is that, look, morality changes over time, and when you have works of art that are just so anathema to the values of today, that's going to mean you can't appreciate it as much as it could have been. And that's going to mean that work of art is not as good as it could have been. It is a serious detriment to the work of art if it is making fundamental moral mistakes about what's awful and what's good. Yeah. Okay, cool. That's really interesting. The case is not the same with moral principles as with speculative opinions of any kind. These are in continual flux and revolution. The son embraces a different system from the father. Nay, scarcely there is a man who can boast of great constancy and uniformity in this particular. Whatever speculative errors may be found in the polite writings of any age or country, they detract but little from the value of those compositions. There needs but be a certain turn of thought or imagination to make us enter into all the opinions which then prevailed and relish the sentiments or conclusions derived from them. But a very violent effort is required to change our judgment of manners and excite sentiments of approbation or blame, love or hatred, different from those to which the mind from long custom has been familiarized. And where a man is confident of the rectitude of that moral standard by which he judges, he is justly jealous of it, and will not pervert the sentiments of his heart for a moment in complaisance to any writer whatsoever. So what he's saying here is that it's easier for us to suspend our judgment when we're reading or engaging with works that have a different understanding from us, right? So works of art from a different time period with different factual pieces, right? Where it's from a different era, so the understanding of the world is different, or factual beliefs are different. And that is easier for us to suspend our judgment and say, oh yeah, well, everybody back then believed the earth was flat, or everybody believed that or back then everybody had to when we watch like period pieces, right, or historical drama or historical fiction, right, those tend to go over very well because it's really easy for people to suspend their judgment and say, oh yeah, that's how they did things back then, or that's how they do things in that part of the world, as long as the moral sentiments are being respected, right? As long as our moral sentiments are being respected, as long as when like there's something really awful happening on screen, there's somebody else on the screen recognizing it as being awful, right? as long as that's happening too, we can suspend our judgment and accept that, things are just being different back then. And that's very different, right? So he's drawing a distinction between like factual stuff being different and having to exercise our imagination in order to, accept or adjust for speculative errors when compared to like moral errors. Okay, of all speculative errors, those which regard religion are the most excusable in compositions of genius. Nor is it ever permitted to judge the civility or wisdom of any people, or of even a single person, by the grossness or refinement of their theological principles. The same good sense that directs men in the ordinary occurrences of life is not hearkened to in religious matters, which are supposed to be placed altogether above the cognizance of human reason. And so he's saying, don't mess with religion. Basically, don't. On this account, all the absurdities of the pagan system of theology must be overlooked by every critic, who would pretend to form a just notion of ancient poetry, and our posterity, in their turn, must have the same indulgences to their forefathers. So basically, like, don't, we can't knock Homer. We can't criticize Homer for not being Catholic, is basically what he's saying here, right? No religious principles can ever be imputed as to fault any poet, while they remain merely principles, and take not such strong possession of the heart as to lay him under the imputation of bigotry or superstition, right? So we can't be like so Catholic or so Christian or so whatever that, when we read pagan poetry, we can't appreciate it because it's like blasphemy or something to enjoy it, right? Where that happens, they confound the sentiments of morality and alter the natural boundaries of vice and virtue. They are therefore eternal blemishes, according to the principle above mentioned, nor are the prejudices and false opinions of the age sufficient to justify them, right? So if you're so judgmental that you can't read anything that's not, in line with your religious beliefs, then that's a knock against your ability as a critic, right? Or your relation to the standards of taste. It is essential to the Roman Catholic religion to inspire a violent hatred of any other worship and to I want to say this would right because I told you he would come back and knock the Catholics. So here he goes. All right. It is essential to the Roman Catholic religion to inspire a violent hatred of every other worship and to represent all pagans, Mahometans, which Muslims, right, and heretics as the objects of divine wrath and vengeance. Such sentiments, though they are in reality very blamable, are considered as virtues by zealots of that communion, and are represented in their tragedies and epic poems as a kind of divine heroism, right? So he's saying, right, to be like a Catholic zealot or a Christian bigot is bad. It's a bad thing. He's saying that's bad, okay? So I told you, he wasn't just knocking Islam. He's not a fan of the Catholic Church either. So there we go, right? Equal opportunity disliker of religion over here. This bigotry has disfigured two very fine tragedies of the French theater, Polyeucte and Athalia. I don't know what these are, and I didn't look them up either. Sorry. Where an intemperate zeal for particular modes of worship is set off with all the pomp imaginable and forms of the predominant character of the heroes. So he's saying that, like, because these kind of awful character traits are praised in, Catholic or in Catholic works of art, you get this sort of amalgam of work that represents people exhibiting kind of awful traits. What is this? Says the sublime Joad to Josabet, finding her in discourse with Methan, the priest of Baal. Does the daughter of David speak to this traitor? Are you not afraid lest the earth should open up and pour forth flames to devour you both? or lest these holy walls should fall and crush you together? What is his purpose? Why comes that enemy of God hither to poison the air we breathe with his horrid breath, or with his hard presence? Such sentiments are received with great applause in the theatre of Paris, but at London the spectators would be full as much pleased to hear Achilles tell Agamemnon that he was a dog in his forehead and a deer in his heart, or Jupiter threaten Juno with a sound drubbing if she will not be quiet. Okay, there's a lot going on here. A lot of references to keep up with. Okay, so basically he's saying that, like, sometimes religion puts us in awkward situations as critics because it commits people to, again, values that aren't really transferable. And, previously when he was talking about ancient morals that change throughout time, he was talking about, like, historical not translating. But now he's talking about, like, contemporary religious differences being responsible for values appearing in works of art that don't really translate from one context to the other, right? Also interesting, Jupiter to threaten Juno with a sound drubbing if she will not be quiet, right? So apparently David Hume is not cool with violence against women. That's what I'm getting out of this line here. I like that. Good for him. Good for him. Last paragraph. Religious principles are also a blemish in any polite composition when they rise up to superstition and intrude themselves into every sentiment, however remote from any connection with religion. It is no excuse for the poet that the customs of his country has burthened life with so many religious ceremonies and observances that no part of it is exempt from that yoke. It must forever be ridiculous in Petrarch to compare his mistress Laura to Jesus Christ, nor is it less ridiculous in that agreeable libertine Boccaccio very seriously to give thanks to God Almighty and the ladies for their assistance in defending him against his enemies. Right? So, so religion also ends up, like, showing up where it doesn't belong in works of art. Right? So it's a thing that critics have to trip over and deal with. Even though there can be religiously themed works of art that transcend and that are, excellent and worth, worthy of, that meet the standard of taste. There are some times where it just gets in the way, and that's that. Ooh, okay, that's it. That's David Hume, Standards of Taste. That's the whole thing. 19 pages. What time are we at? 3 hours. Oof. Okay. Well, shorter than Descartes, so we'll give it that. So I hope you enjoyed that on the Standard of Taste, or of the Standard of Taste by David Hume. Lots of really good stuff in there. Pretty interesting. I had fun going through it. I hope you found that enjoyable. I hope I got most things right. I don't know. Maybe I got some things wrong. I hope not too many. I feel like I did a pretty good job explaining stuff and filling in the gaps in case you have to read this on your own for whatever reason. But I think it's a good introduction to sort of the Humean project and the way that he tries to relate certain attitudes by means of human nature to the world, without relying on, in a way that's utterly empirical, right? Utterly empiricist, I should say, not empirical. It's empiricist. So, yeah, there's Humean empiricism on the Standard of Taste. So there is a standard. It's objective. Everybody should agree with it. And if you don't agree with it, it's because you're under the influence of some sort of imperfection, whether it's your palate is not refined and delicate enough, you didn't practice enough, you didn't do enough comparisons, you're too prejudiced, you're bogged down in religion, or you just have weird preferences. That's it. It's kind of your problem if you don't see the standards of taste, or if you don't have the right standards of taste. That's kind of the moral of the story here, I guess. I don't know. Well, when I put it that way, it's pretty uncharitable. But he makes a pretty classic Humean case for it. I mean, it is an interesting paradox, right? Where on the one hand, on the one hand, there seems to be massive disagreement in matters of taste, and on the other hand, there seems to be some pretty conclusive agreement on at least some enduring works of art and some basic aesthetic judgments about, whether The Room is not as good of a movie as Titanic, right? Those kind of judgments seem pretty solid, and the question is, well, how do those happen? And here's Hume's answer. How do those happen, and why do they so often not happen? That's really the mystery, and this is his attempt at a solution. So there you go. I hope you enjoyed, and I will see you in the next video.